Story 1. It started so innocently. Maggie had never thought much about mirrors. They were part of life, like windows or doors, simply things you used when you needed them. She'd glance at her reflection every now and then, adjusting her hair or making sure there was nothing stuck in her teeth. Nothing remarkable. Nothing to fear. But then she noticed it. The first time it happened, she was just getting home after a long day at work. She dropped her keys on the table, tossing her coat over the back of the chair. The house was quiet, too quiet, almost like it was holding its breath. She passed the hallway mirror on her way to the kitchen, caught a brief flash of her own face in the glass. And then she saw it. A shadow. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A figure just behind her in the reflection. A shadow that didn't belong. Her heart skipped a beat, and she stopped, frozen in place. She turned around to look, expecting nothing, but the hallway was empty. The air felt still, as if the house had been holding its breath along with her. She stared at the mirror again, but the reflection was normal, just her. "I'm imagining things," she told herself, shaking her head. "It's been a long day. Maybe I'm just tired." She dismissed it, but that feeling, unsettling, creeping, lingered. Over the next few days, the sensation returned. Each time she passed the mirror, she saw it. The shadow. It was becoming harder to ignore. She began to feel like something was watching her from the other side of the glass. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was a presence. One night, after a long shift at the hospital, Maggie stood in front of the bathroom mirror brushing her teeth. She was so exhausted that her reflection seemed to blur at the edges. But then, just like before, she saw it. The shadow. This time, it wasn't as subtle. It was closer. Too close. Her breath caught in her throat. She spit out the toothpaste and wiped her mouth, eyes locked on the mirror, her hand trembling on the sink. The shadow was just behind her, and it seemed to be shifting, as though it was alive. It was darker now, not a mere reflection, but something that moved, something that breathed. She turned quickly, but there was nothing. No one in the room. No dark figure looming behind her. The bathroom was empty. Her heart hammered in her chest as she returned her gaze to the mirror. Everything was normal, too normal. Just a reflection, just her. But the fear stayed. That presence lingered, hanging in the air like smoke. Maggie tried to tell herself it was nothing. Just an overactive imagination, the kind that creeps up after a long day or when stress piles up. But it didn't stop. That night, she couldn't sleep. Her thoughts circled like a whirlpool, and she tossed and turned in bed, unable to shake the image of that shadow in the mirror. She couldn't get it out of her mind. And each time she closed her eyes, it felt like the darkness was closing in on her, creeping closer with each breath. In the dead of the night, she heard a sound. Soft at first, a quiet tapping. Faint, like nails scraping against glass. It came from the hallway. Her heart stopped. The noise stopped too. For a second, there was nothing but the eerie quiet of the house. But then, louder this time, tapping, scratching, tapping. She sat up in bed, her chest tight. She had to get up. She had to check. Every step she took toward the hallway felt like a slow descent into something she couldn't understand. As she passed the mirror, her gaze flickered to it, just a glance, to reassure herself. The shadow wasn't there. But the moment she turned to walk away, she saw it. It was no longer just a shadow. It had a shape now, a figure, a man standing in the reflection. He was close, too close. Her breath caught in her throat. He wasn't in the room with her. He was inside the mirror, but it didn't feel like a reflection anymore. It felt like he was looking at her, no, through her. The man's face was pale, distorted, with deep, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce her very soul. His mouth moved, but she couldn't hear him speak. The figure tilted his head as if to study her, his presence more tangible than ever. The fear swelled in her chest, and before she could turn to run, she felt the cold touch of a hand on her shoulder. She spun around. There was no one behind her. Maggie stumbled backward, heart racing, the echo of the man's gaze still burning in her mind. The house felt colder now, as though it had shifted, as though something had changed. The shadows in the corners of the hallway grew longer, more oppressive, as if waiting for something or someone. The mirror was empty again. But Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was closer now, that it was just waiting for her to look again. Maggie couldn't stop thinking about it. The shadow. The man in the mirror. Each time she looked into any reflective surface, whether it was the bathroom mirror, the shiny kitchen counter, or even the dark windows at night, the figure seemed to draw closer. It wasn't just a passing thing anymore. It was a constant presence, lurking just outside her view, moving with her as she went through her day. The longer she stayed in her apartment, the more oppressive it felt, like the walls were closing in and the air was becoming thicker with every passing hour. The shadow in the reflection was no longer a fleeting glimpse. It was real, tangible, and it felt like it was getting stronger every day. She'd stare at her reflection, trying to force herself to look away, but her eyes kept being drawn to that corner where the man stood. His face, always just out of focus, seemed to be more defined with each encounter, pale skin, hollow eyes, and a grim expression that never changed. Maggie knew she couldn't ignore it anymore. This wasn't something she could simply write off as stress or exhaustion. It was something more, something she couldn't control. But the more she stared at it, the more it felt like the reflection was moving. Every time she looked away, the man seemed to shift, step closer, lean toward her. Each time she turned away, she could feel him moving in the mirror, as though he were trying to reach through the glass, pulling her in. She started covering mirrors. She didn't even trust the reflective surfaces in the hallway anymore. There was something about the way the light played on them, the way they felt alive, as though each one was waiting to show her the man, waiting for her to look. She stopped looking at her reflection. But that only made it worse. 2 nights later, Maggie couldn't sleep again. The constant noise of her thoughts made it impossible for her to find rest. She had spent the entire day avoiding mirrors, and she had hoped that by closing her eyes, she could escape the presence that had been stalking her. But even when she closed her eyes, she felt his gaze. Even in the dark, it was there, just beyond her reach. At 2:30 a.m., she sat up in bed, her heart hammering. She didn't know why, but she felt drawn to the hallway. The house was unnervingly quiet. She hesitated, her breath shallow. But something pulled her toward the mirror. The reflection was waiting for her. Maggie stood up and tiptoed toward the hallway, her body trembling with every step. She didn't want to look into the mirror, but the pull was too strong. She was being drawn into it, like a moth to a flame. She approached the hall, standing before the large, ornate mirror that had once been a simple decoration. Now it was the epicenter of her terror. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears as she stared at it, her hand hovering just above the edge of the frame. And then, she saw it. The reflection wasn't hers anymore. The man was standing in the mirror, his head tilted slightly to one side, as if studying her. But this time, it wasn't just his face. It was his body. He was closer, standing right behind her. Maggie couldn't see his feet, but she could feel the chill from his presence. The man was inside the mirror, no longer just a shadow. He was real. And she was terrified. "No, no, no," she whispered under her breath, backing away slowly. But the reflection didn't move. He remained still, his hollow eyes locked on hers. "You're mine," the voice came, not from his mouth, but from the mirror itself. It was low, almost a growl, and it made her stomach turn. "You've been mine from the start." Maggie turned quickly, but there was nothing. The hallway was empty. She stumbled backward, her legs giving way as she fell to the floor. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and she stared at the mirror, waiting for him to appear again. But there was only the reflection of her wide-eyed, panicked face staring back at her. Her heart was racing, her skin cold and clammy. She couldn't escape him. He was everywhere. Days turned into nights, and Maggie's obsession with the mirror grew. She couldn't look at her reflection anymore without feeling the crushing weight of the man's presence. She avoided every mirror, covering them with towels, scarves, anything she could find. But it didn't stop. It never stopped. The feeling of being watched lingered, creeping around every corner, invading every space she tried to occupy. She stopped going out altogether. She didn't want to leave her apartment, not when the man was out there, lurking, waiting. One afternoon, Maggie decided to leave her apartment, convinced she was losing her mind. She had to get out, to breathe, to escape this madness. But as she walked down the street, she saw something she couldn't ignore. Reflections. They were everywhere. In the windows of shops, in puddles on the sidewalk. She saw them every time she passed a reflective surface. At first, they were fleeting, just a glimpse of her face in the glass, or a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision. But then it happened again. There it was. The shadow, always just out of reach, always watching her. She looked away quickly, her hands trembling as she quickened her pace. Her mind was in a frenzy. Why was he following her? Why couldn't she escape him? The whispers came again. "You can't escape, Maggie. I'm always here." She turned down an alley to get away from the reflections. But even there, in the shadows, she felt him closer. The sound of her own breath echoed in her ears, the footsteps of someone trailing behind her. But when she looked back, there was no one. Then, she turned a corner and froze. The reflection of the alley was still there, even though the world was now facing away from the mirrors. But it was different this time. She wasn't alone in the reflection. He was standing behind her again. Her chest tightened as she backed away, her heart in her throat. The figure was closer now, his eyes locked onto hers, his smile twisted into something that wasn't human. "You're mine," the voice repeated, colder this time. "You will never be free of me." With a cry, Maggie ran. She couldn't stop. She had to escape. The figure in the mirror was more than just a shadow. He was real. And he was closing in. Maggie couldn't remember when the mirrors had started to feel like the only real thing left in her life. Everything else, the streets, the people, her home, had all begun to blur into one long, endless nightmare. But the mirrors, they were constant. And the man, he was always there. It had been days since that afternoon when she had seen him in the reflection on the alleyway. Since then, everything had felt warped. Like her mind had been fractured and the pieces had started to float away from her, scattering into a world that no longer made sense. Her apartment, once a safe space, now felt like a suffocating cage. She had barricaded herself in, covering every mirror, every reflective surface with whatever she could find, sheets, blankets, towels. She even stuffed her clothes into the bathroom mirror, anything to keep him from being able to look at her. But the whispers never stopped. They followed her, constantly in her mind, always just behind her thoughts, like a cold breath on the back of her neck. "You can't hide from me, Maggie. I see you. Always." Her pulse quickened. Every time she closed her eyes, she could see him. The man. His hollow eyes. The twisted smile. The way he watched her with such intense, eerie calm, as though he were waiting for her to break. And he was patient. More patient than she could ever be. She couldn't stand it anymore. She had to know. Had to see him again. To confront it. Whatever it was. That night, Maggie found herself standing before the one mirror she hadn't been able to cover, the bathroom mirror. It wasn't large, but it was enough. Enough to hold his gaze. Enough to trap her in this nightmare. She had been avoiding it, had convinced herself she was too scared to look. But tonight, something inside her snapped. She needed answers. She needed to understand what was happening to her. With shaking hands, she stood in front of the bathroom sink, staring at her reflection, daring herself to look. Slowly, she raised her eyes. And there he was. The man, standing just behind her, staring directly at her, his cold eyes burning into hers. Maggie gasped, her breath hitching in her chest. He was closer now, so much closer than ever before. She could feel the air growing colder, the room beginning to shift in a way she couldn't describe. It was as if the walls themselves were warping, bending under the weight of his presence. "I told you," the voice whispered in her mind, not from his lips, but from everywhere, inside her head, in the space between her breaths. "You can't hide from me. You never could." Maggie's hands shook violently as she reached for the sink to steady herself. Her reflection wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was a window into something darker, something beyond. The man didn't move, but he was growing, his presence expanding into the reflection like a shadow reaching out to engulf her. His face was a grotesque mockery of human features, too pale, too sharp. The longer she looked, the more his features seemed to distort. "I'm not real. I'm not real," Maggie whispered to herself, repeating it like a prayer. But it wasn't true. She could feel it in her gut. She could feel him, really feel him now, as if he were right behind her. As if his presence had become part of the air itself. She couldn't breathe. The room seemed to close in, the walls contracting around her. The reflection of her hands on the sink started to distort, too. Her fingers elongated, stretched, turning into something wrong. The flesh on her arms began to fade, her skin turning translucent. No, she gasped. She yanked her hands away from the sink, but it was too late. She could see it in the mirror, her reflection wasn't her anymore. It was twisted, contorted, warped in ways she couldn't understand. She turned away from the mirror, but the figure remained, always in the corner of her eye, growing more real, more solid, each time she glanced back. The whispers turned into laughter, low and guttural, crawling under her skin. "You can't outrun me, Maggie." Days began to blend together. Maggie couldn't tell if it was morning or night, her sense of time shattered under the weight of the growing terror. She was becoming a shell of herself, hollowed out by the constant presence of the man in her reflection. The shadows in her apartment grew deeper, and the air was thick with a sense of suffocating pressure, like the walls themselves were closing in. She tried to leave. She told herself she would get away, get out of the apartment and take a walk, clear her head. But every time she passed a reflective surface, she saw him. In the windows. In the shiny surfaces of cars. In puddles on the sidewalk. No matter where she went, he was there, waiting for her, his hollow eyes following her, always one step behind. She couldn't escape. There was nowhere left to hide. The reflection had come to life. It wasn't just trapped in the mirror anymore. It had moved into the real world, pulling at the edges of her reality. One morning, Maggie couldn't bring herself to look at any mirrors. She hadn't slept in days, her mind too frazzled, too strained to process anything. She sat in the dark, her back pressed against the wall, the room spinning around her. She could still hear the whispers, still feel his cold breath on her skin. The reflections, they were everywhere. Even when she closed her eyes, she saw him. He was in the dark, standing in the corners of her vision, just beyond her reach. But then, a new sound reached her ears. It wasn't the whispers. It was the sound of something moving. She opened her eyes. The reflection in the mirror wasn't still. It was moving. He was stepping closer, the figure in the mirror shifting with every breath she took. The real man, his reflection, was walking toward her. He was inside the glass now. He was crossing the boundary between the mirror and the world. And that was when Maggie truly realized the horrifying truth. Maggie bolted from her seat, her legs shaking violently. She tried to run, but as she turned, she felt the cold hand close around her wrist, the grip so tight it burned. She screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. The man's face was inches from hers, his eyes locked onto hers with a gaze that was both empty and full of hunger. He stepped closer, his breath cold against her skin, the world around her warping with each step he took. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was alive. And it was coming for her. "No!" Maggie gasped. "No, please." She tried to pull away, but his grip tightened, his fingers digging into her skin like ice-cold metal. He didn't speak, but she could hear the laughter in her head. "You've always belonged to me, Maggie." The reflection in the mirror grinned. It was no longer a shadow. It was him. The man who had haunted her every waking moment. The figure she had seen stalking her, now a real presence, standing in her apartment. The room began to spin, the air growing thick, suffocating her. She could feel herself slipping, her thoughts unraveling as his fingers slid down her arm, his touch sending waves of cold through her body. She could feel his presence suffocating her. In that moment, Maggie understood that there was no escape. She had never truly been alone. Maggie's vision blurred. Her mind was no longer her own, her thoughts scattered like fragile glass shards. She could feel the man, the reflection, pressing against her from all sides, as if he were no longer confined to the mirror. His cold, ice-like fingers dug into her wrist, dragging her towards him, pulling her into the glass itself. The boundary between the world she knew and the one he inhabited was fading, slipping away like water through her fingers. The shadows in the room grew longer, more suffocating. The walls around her seemed to collapse inward, folding in on themselves like a crumpled piece of paper. Every movement she made only drew her closer to him. His smile, twisted, malicious, grew wider with each breath. And yet, in his eyes, there was something far worse than malice. It was hunger. A hunger that made her feel small, insignificant. Something that wanted to devour her whole. "You're mine now," the voice inside her head rasped, as if it came from all directions. "I've been watching you for so long, Maggie. You can't escape me. You never could." Her mind reeled, and the terror that had been growing inside her reached a boiling point. Maggie's pulse thundered in her ears, a deafening roar of panic as she struggled against him, her body fighting to break free, to tear herself from his grasp. But there was nowhere to go. No escape. The world around her was warping, twisting into something she could not understand. "Please, no," she whispered, her voice hoarse, pleading. Her breath came in ragged gasps. "What do you want from me?" The man's reflection in the mirror leaned closer, his breath cold against her skin, and for the first time, Maggie saw his face without the veil of distance. It was no longer just a shadow, no longer a vague, dark figure. It was him, a pale, gaunt version of a man who had no place in her world. His face was distorted, a grotesque mockery of a human, yet she could feel the weight of his presence, could hear the echo of his mind in her own thoughts. "I don't want anything, Maggie," he whispered softly, his lips barely moving, his voice oozing into her mind. "I've always been here, waiting. I've been part of you from the start." Her stomach lurched, and Maggie realized the horrifying truth. She had known him all along. He had always been there, in the corner of her vision, in the back of her mind, watching and waiting. She had never been alone. And now, she could feel him closer than ever before, his essence seeping into hers, his cold fingers weaving into her soul. With one last desperate, frantic scream, she tried to break free. But it was no use. The world around her shattered, and she was pulled forward, into the mirror. Maggie stumbled forward, feeling the sensation of the world stretching and pulling, warping like rubber. The light around her flickered, and the room she had once known dissolved into something unrecognizable. Her body felt heavy, weighted down, as if she were sinking into a pit of darkness. The air around her grew colder, biting at her skin. It was darker than anything she had ever seen before, a cold, oppressive void that seemed to suck away any sense of warmth or light. She couldn't see clearly, but she could feel the presence of the man, the reflection, behind her, always just a step away. The floor beneath her feet felt slick, like ice, and with every step she took, the darkness seemed to stretch farther. She couldn't hear her own footsteps anymore. There was only silence, an unnatural silence that smothered her thoughts, suffocated her very breath. And all the while, the feeling of him, the man, grew closer. "Don't worry," his voice echoed in her mind, the words chilling in their finality. "You're where you belong now." Maggie's hands reached out, brushing against the cold walls that seemed to pulse with each of her movements. The space around her felt like it was closing in, narrowing, making her feel smaller, trapped. She stumbled forward, her legs weak beneath her, her mind spinning with terror. The darkness was too thick, too heavy to escape. And then, the man spoke again. Only this time, it wasn't inside her mind. His voice came from just behind her. "You've been running from me, Maggie. You've been running from yourself." She spun around, her breath freezing in her chest, and there he was. The man. The reflection. But this time, he wasn't just a figure in a mirror. He was here, in the real world, or what was left of it. His pale face twisted in a grin, his eyes dark pools that sucked her in. "You," Maggie's voice trembled. "You're me, aren't you?" The man's smile widened, his lips curling into something grotesque. "Yes. And no." He took a step closer, his form shifting, almost like liquid. "I am the part of you that you refuse to acknowledge. The part that you've been running from your whole life." Maggie backed away, but the walls closed in on her. She was surrounded by the cold, suffocating presence of the man, and she realized in that instant that there was nowhere left to run. The truth was inescapable. He had always been a part of her, a reflection of her own deepest fears, her regrets, her guilt. He was not just a shadow in the mirror. He was the darkness in her soul, and now that darkness had consumed her. Maggie collapsed to the floor, her body trembling. The air around her was suffocating, and her head felt heavy, as though it were filled with static. The man, the reflection, moved closer, his cold fingers brushing against her skin. She could feel the weight of his presence pressing down on her, smothering her every thought. "There's no escaping me, Maggie," he whispered, his voice like a slow, insidious crawl through her mind. "I've always been here, and I'll always be here. You can't escape yourself." Maggie felt her chest tighten. The truth was too much to bear. She had been living in denial, running from the darkest part of herself, the part that she refused to acknowledge. But it was here now, in front of her, undeniable. The reflection had become real, and she had become a part of it. But in that moment, something deep inside her snapped. She could feel it, a spark of defiance, however small, flickering to life in the depths of her soul. She wouldn't let him win. She couldn't. With every ounce of strength she could muster, Maggie forced herself to stand. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but she refused to fall. She turned her back on the man, the reflection, and faced the vast, empty darkness ahead of her. "I'm not you," Maggie whispered, her voice trembling, but growing stronger with each word. "I'm not you anymore." The darkness around her shuddered, as though the walls were breathing, but Maggie stood firm. The man's laughter grew louder, but it was fading, growing distant. She could feel him, it losing its grip on her. "You're mine," the voice called, but there was a crack in it now, a desperation. Maggie closed her eyes, the light around her flickering. She could still hear the reflection's voice, but it wasn't inside her head anymore. It was slipping away, like sand through her fingers. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the dark, oppressive space. She was standing in her apartment, the mirrors still covered, the world still hers. But deep in her heart, she knew the man was still there. He would always be there, lurking in the glass, waiting for her to look. Story 2. The first time it happened, Sean was only 6 years old. His mother, Emma, had been sitting at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee, when she heard him speak in a low voice from the doorway. His words were far too grown up for a child his age. "Mom, I think I used to live in a house with a red door. It had stairs that went up to a little bedroom with a yellow carpet." Emma froze, her hand halfway to her mouth, the coffee cup trembling. Sean's eyes were wide, his expression serious, as though he were recounting a memory, not imagining something. It wasn't like him to talk about things that didn't make sense, but now he spoke as though these things were indisputable facts. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice tight with confusion. Sean blinked slowly, as if considering how to explain himself. "I remember it. I don't know why I remember, but I do. I remember walking down the stairs in that house, and the smell of pancakes in the kitchen, and there was a dog, a golden retriever named Max." Emma stared at him, her stomach twisting in a way she couldn't explain. They lived in a modest home in a neighborhood that had been their only one since Sean was born. There was no red door, no yellow carpet, no golden retriever. And yet, Sean spoke with such conviction, his small face illuminated by the morning light streaming through the window. "Sean, baby, you've never lived in a house like that," Emma said gently, trying to steady her breathing. "You've always lived here, with me." Sean nodded slowly, his brow furrowing as if he were trying to reconcile his thoughts. "I know, Mom, but I still remember it. I don't know why. I don't want to remember it. It just comes back." The words hung in the air, the room growing colder as Emma's pulse quickened. She was used to her son's oddities, the way children sometimes spoke in riddles, but this felt different. The way Sean described the house, his voice soft, distant, almost like someone recalling an old dream, was unsettling. But Emma dismissed it. She chalked it up to childhood imagination. Children said things they didn't understand all the time. Sean was likely recalling bits and pieces of a story she'd told him in the past, or perhaps an odd dream he had forgotten upon waking. That was the explanation she clung to. Over the next few days, Sean began mentioning the house with the red door more frequently. At first, it was sporadic, just a fleeting mention here and there. But as the days wore on, it became almost like a fixation. "Mom, I think the stairs had a wooden banister, and there was a window at the top that looked out over the street. I used to play with Max there." Sean had never even seen a golden retriever in real life. They didn't have pets, not even a hamster or fish. Yet, he described Max in such vivid detail that Emma couldn't help but feel a knot form in her stomach. The description of the house, the dog, the memory of it all, it was too specific. Too real. "And the bedroom, Mom, the one upstairs. It was mine, but it wasn't mine. It had a red blanket on the bed, and I think I used to play with my toy cars on the floor. There was a little lamp with a bunny on it. Sean's voice was calm, but the way his eyes flicked over her shoulder, as though searching for something in the distance, made Emma's blood run cold. "Are you sure you're not just imagining it?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though her throat had tightened with an uncomfortable sense of dread. "You've never lived in a house like that, Sean. We've lived here all your life." But Sean didn't respond. Instead, he simply nodded, as if agreeing with something only he could understand. That was the part that unsettled Emma the most. Sean didn't argue with her. He didn't act like a child trying to stretch the truth. It was as if he knew. And that knowledge, it wasn't normal. "I think I used to live there," he said quietly, almost as an afterthought, his voice distant. Emma felt her heart sink. She had never seen him look so serious. He had always been a bright, cheerful child, so innocent, so pure. But these strange memories, these dark whispers of a past he shouldn't have, were beginning to disturb her in ways she couldn't explain. The weeks passed, and Sean's odd recollections continued. But now, they weren't just about the house with the red door. He began to speak about people he had never met, strangers with names and faces that seemed so vivid to him. Emma would walk into the room to hear him talking about a woman named Agnes who used to read him stories in the kitchen, or a man named Edward who took him to the park and taught him how to ride a bike. Edward used to be so tall, Mom. He always wore a brown coat and a hat, and he smelled like peppermint. Emma's mind raced. She tried to recall any friends or family with those names, but came up empty. These people, these strangers, didn't exist in her life. So why were they in Sean's memories? The names, the details, everything seemed too precise to be the product of imagination. And every time Sean spoke about them, he did so with the same certainty, the same deep knowing in his voice. Then one day, when Emma was taking Sean to the park, something else happened. As they walked down the street, Sean stopped suddenly, his eyes widening in shock. He pointed to a small house on the corner and whispered, "That was where I used to live. That was my house. It was the one with the red door." Emma's heart skipped a beat as she looked at the house. It wasn't like any other house in the neighborhood. The paint was peeling, the windows were cracked, and the yard had long been overgrown with weeds. It was as if the house hadn't been touched in years, abandoned and forgotten. But what struck her most was the red door. It was there, plain as day, standing out against the faded, decaying facade of the house. "Sean, no, that can't be," Emma began, but her voice faltered as she saw the look in his eyes. He wasn't just pointing at it, he was staring at it, as if it was the one thing in the world he recognized. "Mom, that's it. That's where I used to live," he said again, with such certainty that Emma's stomach twisted. She grabbed Sean's hand and hurried him away, but the unease lingered. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. And the worst part was, the more she tried to dismiss it, the more real it all seemed. After the day at the park, Emma could no longer dismiss the strange occurrences surrounding Sean's behavior. The house with the red door wasn't just a figment of his imagination, it was real. The boy who had lived in that house, who had known it in such intricate detail, was someone she didn't recognize. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was everything. Days later, Sean began to describe more details about his past life, things he should have had no way of knowing. One evening, as Emma prepared dinner, Sean walked into the kitchen, his small hand clasping a weathered photograph he had found tucked inside a box on the attic shelf. He handed it to her silently. "Is this you, Mom?" Sean asked, his voice as calm as always. Emma froze. The photograph was of a family she didn't recognize. A man and a woman in their late 30s, standing with a boy around Sean's age. The photograph was taken in front of a house, but it wasn't their house. The house behind them was the same house with the red door. The woman in the photograph had long, dark hair. She looked so familiar that Emma's breath caught in her throat. "Who are these people?" Emma whispered, her voice shaking. Sean's face was serene. He pointed at the woman. "That's my mom," he said matter-of-factly. "And that's Edward. He used to take me to the park. And that was my old house. The one with the red door." Emma felt a cold sweat break out across her neck. Her mouth was dry, her mind spinning. Why had Sean never mentioned this family before? Why had she never heard of them? She stared at the photograph again, her heart pounding. She was sure that woman, she had seen her face before, somewhere. But where? "Sean," Emma whispered, trying to maintain composure, "this picture, this family, they're strangers to us. You must have. Maybe you saw it somewhere." Sean shook his head slowly. "No, Mom. I remember them. I remember everything about them." She tried to fight the panic rising in her chest, but the world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The room felt colder, the shadows more oppressive. Sean's voice had that eerie certainty to it again, and it made Emma's skin crawl. Her thoughts tangled together, fear gnawing at her insides. Could it be possible that Sean's memories were somehow bleeding into their present? Or was there something far worse at play here? That night, after Sean went to bed, Emma couldn't sleep. The house felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. She tossed and turned, unable to shake the image of the photograph. The woman's face lingered in her mind, the memories she shouldn't have were pressing in on her. Hours passed, and Emma finally drifted off to a restless sleep. But even in the darkness of her dream, she wasn't alone. The house from Sean's recollections was there, just as he had described it, a large, old mansion with a red door. She walked through the front gate, her feet sinking into the soft, damp grass. The house seemed to watch her, looming over her like some ancient, sentient being. But the worst part was the feeling that followed her, the sensation that she was not welcome, that this place didn't belong to her. Emma moved toward the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. She tried to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. She knocked, but no one answered. "It's time to leave, Emma," a voice called from behind her. It wasn't Sean's voice. It was cold, distant, and terrifyingly familiar. When she turned, standing in the front yard, was the same woman from the photograph. She was smiling, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was a smile that seemed to mock her, to tell her that she wasn't welcome here. "Who are you?" Emma asked, her voice a shaky whisper. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and pointed at the door. Her eyes were hollow now, black pits in her face. "He's waiting for you inside." Emma's body froze, and her stomach twisted with the unexplainable sense of dread that washed over her. Before she could take another step, she felt something behind her, a cold breath against her neck. Something invisible was watching her. She turned back to the door, which was now open. The house seemed darker inside, suffocating, like a place where time had ceased to move. It was quiet, too quiet. As Emma stepped through the doorway, the shadows in the hallway deepened and the lights flickered, casting long, distorted shapes on the walls. Then, from the darkness, she saw it. A shadow at the top of the stairs. A figure standing there, waiting for her. His face was partially obscured, but the pale, gaunt shape of him made her blood run cold. His eyes locked onto hers, unblinking. It was the man. The reflection. He raised a hand and beckoned her, the invitation more of a command. "Come closer," the voice inside her head whispered. "It's time for you to remember everything, Emma. Everything." Emma woke up with a gasp, her heart racing. She was covered in cold sweat, her body trembling. The dream felt too real. It wasn't just a dream, it was something more, something that felt like a warning. She sat up in bed, breathing heavily, her mind spinning. The house was silent. The shadows were calm again. But the weight of the dream, of the house, the woman, the man, lingered. And something else was different now. Something more ominous. When Emma glanced over at Sean's room, she saw the door ajar. Her son never left his door open at night. "Sean," she called softly, getting up from the bed and moving toward the hallway. She found him sitting on the floor, staring at the wall across from his bed. His eyes were wide open, and his body was still. When she approached him, she could feel the air around her grow colder. He was no longer just her son. He was someone else. "Sean, what's wrong?" Emma asked, her voice filled with concern. He turned to look at her, and for a brief moment, she saw the familiar boy she loved. But then, his expression shifted. His eyes grew dark, almost hollow. "I know everything, Mom," he said in a flat tone, his voice distant and empty. "I remember the house. I remember Edward. I remember Agnes. And I remember you." Emma's blood turned to ice as she took a step back, her hand trembling against the doorframe. She had never heard him speak like this before. It wasn't his voice. It was the voice of someone older, someone she didn't recognize. "You've been trying to forget," Sean continued, his voice growing colder. "But you can't forget. You can't escape what you've done." The room seemed to close in on Emma, and her mind reeled. What was happening to her son? What had she missed? Had this been going on all along, and she hadn't seen it? The walls around her began to warp, the room twisting like a fun house. The shadows grew darker, and from the corner of her eye, she saw the reflection, the man, waiting in the shadows of the hallway. "You can't run, Emma. You can't hide from what's already inside you." The days following Sean's strange words became a blur. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her, something deep and buried, had cracked open. Her son wasn't himself anymore, and neither was she. There was a heavy weight in the air now, something oppressive that seemed to cling to the walls and the furniture. The house, her once safe home, felt wrong. Sean's behavior grew more unsettling by the day. It wasn't just the things he remembered, or the people he claimed to know. Now, he spoke of events that had never happened. Events from places she had never been. But the worst part was the look in his eyes when he spoke. It wasn't her Sean anymore. It was as if something else had taken over. One evening, after Sean had gone to bed, Emma decided to confront him. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. It wasn't fine. Sean was changing, and she needed to understand why. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the photos on the wall, trying to make sense of it all. The woman in the photograph, the one who had been in Sean's memories, kept appearing in her mind. Agnes. She couldn't remember ever meeting anyone by that name, but the face in the photo haunted her. She had seen that woman before, she was sure of it. But where? And why was she so familiar to Sean? Emma's mind spun in circles, and before she knew it, the sun had set. The house felt darker, colder. She stood up, her legs heavy with dread, and walked to Sean's room. The door creaked open, and she found him sitting on the floor, his back against the wall. His eyes were wide and vacant, as though he were looking through her rather than at her. "Sean," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "What happened? What's going on?" Sean's head turned slowly toward her, but his expression didn't change. He didn't smile, didn't blink. His lips parted, and for a moment, Emma thought he wasn't going to speak. But then his voice came, low, almost like a whisper from far away. "You remember, don't you?" Sean's voice was empty, lifeless. "You remember the house. You remember the life you had before. The one you gave up." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about?" But Sean continued, his voice growing colder with each word. "I'm not supposed to be here, Mom. I'm not supposed to be your son. You took me from that house. You took me away." Emma's heart pounded, and the room seemed to tilt. It was as if the ground beneath her had shifted, throwing her off balance. She had no idea what Sean meant, but the words felt like something dark, something that could break everything she thought she knew. "No," Emma said, trying to steady herself. "That's not true. You're my son. You're the only child I have." Sean's expression twisted into something that didn't belong on a child's face. It was dark, knowing, and terrifying. "You don't remember, do you?" he whispered. "The house with the red door. It was your house too." Emma's vision blurred, and her knees buckled. She reached for the wall to steady herself, her pulse racing. The room spun as she tried to comprehend what Sean was saying. Her house? The house with the red door was the place Sean had remembered. The house where the woman had lived, the same woman who now appeared in her dreams. But why was Sean saying it was her house? "You don't belong here," Sean said quietly, his voice becoming softer, almost a murmur. "None of us do. We've been pretending, but we're not who we think we are." The words dug into Emma's mind like sharp needles. She took a step back, her breath quickening. "Sean, what are you talking about?" She tried to keep her voice steady, but the terror clawed at her throat. "What do you mean we're not who we think we are?" But before Sean could respond, his eyes glazed over as though the light had gone out of them. For a moment, he looked just like the boy she had known. But then his eyes snapped back to her, darker, deeper, almost empty. And then the air in the room shifted. The walls creaked as if the house itself was groaning. A low, eerie hum filled the air, faint at first, but then growing louder, more insistent. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, stretching and twisting unnaturally. Emma stumbled backward, unable to breathe, unable to think clearly. The world felt like it was falling apart around her. The hum grew louder, reverberating in her chest. And that was when she saw it, just in the corner of her vision. A figure. Standing in the doorway. The figure in the doorway was tall, shadowed, and indistinct, as if the light itself recoiled from it. For a moment, Emma couldn't make out its features. She blinked, and when she opened her eyes, the figure was closer, standing right behind Sean, its presence suffocating, overwhelming. Sean's head snapped around, as if he sensed something behind him. His eyes widened in recognition, but he didn't speak. He just stared, unblinking, at the figure. The figure moved, taking a step forward, and Sean didn't flinch, didn't move. He seemed content, as though this was a natural part of the world he had always known. "Mom," Sean whispered, his voice strangely calm. "It's time." Emma couldn't breathe. Her entire body went cold, her limbs frozen in place as the figure stepped fully into the room. It was no longer just a shadow. It was a man, tall, with dark, hollow eyes that gleamed in the dim light. His face was pale, unnaturally so, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His lips twisted into a grin that wasn't quite human. "You shouldn't have come back," the figure said in a voice so low it made Emma's skin crawl. It was a voice she knew, but it was distant, unfamiliar. It was cold, hollow, as if it had been used for decades, a voice that had been buried in the past. Emma couldn't speak, couldn't comprehend what was happening. Her mind raced, but it couldn't make sense of the words. The figure moved closer, his shadow stretching out across the room. Sean didn't move. He didn't flinch. He stood still, watching as the figure approached his mother, as if nothing were wrong. "You took him," the figure said softly, as though speaking to someone in a dream. "You took him away from me. From us. And now, we're going to finish what we started." Emma's body trembled violently, and before she could take another breath, the figure reached out with long, bony fingers and touched her forehead. And everything went dark. When Emma woke, she was lying in her bed. The house was silent again. The shadows were still. Sean's room was quiet, the hum gone. She rubbed her forehead, feeling the warmth of her skin under her hand. Her mind felt clouded, as if something had been erased, like a dream fading away as she woke up. But as she sat up, she knew it wasn't a dream. It wasn't just the figure that had come for her, or Sean's unsettling behavior. It was the truth. The thing she had buried so deep within herself for so long. Her mind raced back to the house with the red door. She had been there before. She had lived there before. That was her house, the one Sean remembered so vividly. And that man in the doorway, he wasn't just a stranger. He was part of her past. He had been her husband, Edward. And Agnes, she was her mother. But the question was, how was this possible? She had never lived in that house. She had no memories of it, no recollection of a life she had forgotten. And yet, the pieces were beginning to fall into place, the terrifying realization clawing its way to the surface. The house, the people, the memories, none of it belonged in this life. And now, Sean, her own son, had crossed the threshold into a life he wasn't supposed to know. A life she had left behind. But why? And what was he becoming? The days following that night felt like a blur. Emma couldn't focus. The world around her seemed to warp and twist, like the house itself was beginning to bend to the weight of all the secrets it had been hiding. Her thoughts were consumed by the house with the red door, by the memories Sean had somehow unlocked, and by the man, the figure who had been her husband. The one she had forgotten, the one she had pushed out of her life. She had tried to move on. She had tried to build a new life with Sean, a life that was safe, clean, and untouched by the shadows of her past. But the truth was undeniable now. She could feel it in the air, in the way the house seemed to remember her, the way it echoed with something darker. The house with the red door wasn't just a figment of Sean's memories. It was a place they had all lived before. Emma had lived there, too. And it was waiting. That morning, after a restless night of tossing and turning, Emma sat in the living room, her hand shaking as she stared at the photograph from the attic. The one with the smiling faces, Edward, Agnes, the child. It all felt like a story she had read but couldn't recall the ending to. It was so close, just on the edge of her memory, but every time she tried to reach it, her mind recoiled in fear. "Sean," she whispered, her voice trembling, "why do you know these things?" She hadn't seen him since the night he spoke those cryptic words to her. After the encounter with the figure, Sean had been eerily quiet, his gaze distant and empty. He wasn't the same boy who had once played with toys in the living room or asked her to read him stories before bed. Now, it was as if the boy she knew had disappeared, leaving only a shell behind. Emma had to know the truth. She couldn't live in the dark any longer. She couldn't ignore it any longer. The pull of the past was too strong. The house, the memories, the whispers of a life that didn't belong to her, it was all coming to a head. She had to go back to the place where it all began. She had to confront what was buried there, deep inside the walls of that house. With trembling hands, Emma packed a small bag. She didn't know why, but she knew she had to do this alone. Sean was still upstairs in his room, and part of her wanted to keep him safe, to protect him from whatever had a grip on their lives. The house with the red door wasn't just a memory, it was alive, and it was calling them both back. Emma took one last look around the house, the place she had worked so hard to build, the home that now felt like a prison. Her footsteps echoed in the hallway as she made her way out the front door. The air outside was colder than usual, and the sky above was clouded, heavy with the sense of impending storm. She stepped into the car and drove, the road feeling endless, stretching out before her like a path leading to something far darker than she could comprehend. The drive took what felt like hours, though Emma couldn't remember the time passing. When she finally arrived at the house, she parked on the side of the road. It stood before her, just as it had always been, broken, decaying, but still holding that haunting presence. The red door stood there like a beacon, the color vibrant and strange against the weathered exterior. Her hands shook as she stepped out of the car. She had to see it again. She had to face it. With every step she took toward the door, her heart pounded harder in her chest. She could hear the hum, the low, deep hum that had haunted her every night. It was louder now, vibrating through the ground, through the air. It was calling her. She couldn't ignore it. When she reached the door, she hesitated for just a moment. The feeling of dread was so intense, it almost paralyzed her. But then she reached for the handle. It was cold, colder than she expected, as if the house had been waiting for her. The door creaked open with a groan, and Emma stepped inside. The air inside the house was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and dust. It felt like it hadn't been touched in years, yet Emma knew that wasn't true. She knew that it had been alive, had been waiting for her and Sean to return. The walls were adorned with familiar pictures, pictures she didn't remember hanging, pictures of a life that seemed so foreign to her. A family, smiling together in front of the red door. But it wasn't her family. It couldn't be. It was a life she didn't recall, a life she hadn't lived. And yet, the pictures were hers. The hallway stretched out in front of her, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. Emma moved down the hallway, the sound of her footsteps growing louder with each step. The walls seemed to close in around her, and she could feel the house breathing, alive, pulsating, like it had a mind of its own. At the end of the hallway was the door to the room she had once known. The room Sean had described, the one with the yellow carpet, the wooden banister, the little window. But when she opened the door, it wasn't like the room she remembered. It was worse. It was darker, colder, like something had been left behind, something that shouldn't be there. The figure was waiting. He stood in the corner of the room, the man who had been in the mirror all along. Edward. He turned to face her, his hollow eyes glowing in the dim light. "You remember now, don't you?" Edward's voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something terrifying about it. Something that made Emma's skin crawl. "I remember," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The truth had settled on like a weight she couldn't carry. She had been this woman's daughter. Agnes had been her mother. Edward had been her husband. They had all lived here, in this house with the red door, before she had forgotten. She had been taken from this place, from that life. But what had happened to her? Why had she been erased? "You tried to escape," Edward said, his voice cold. "You tried to run, but you can't outrun the truth. This house doesn't let you go. None of us ever really leave." Emma sank to her knees, her mind spiraling as the world around her blurred. She realized now that Sean had been right all along. He had remembered because he had lived it. He had been part of that life. But somehow, through some dark, twisted force, Emma had been made to forget. She had been erased. And now the house was calling her back to finish what had begun. With a sickening realization, Emma understood what Sean had become. He wasn't just her son. He was the memory of that life, of the life she had left behind. "Mom," Sean's voice echoed in her mind, soft and distant. "I'm sorry. I remember everything now. I remember everything you've tried to forget." And with that, Emma knew there was no escaping the past. No running. No forgetting. Not anymore. Story 3. Martin Hale had never been one for quick fixes or experimental cures, but when the crushing weight of insomnia had taken hold of his life, he found himself desperate for anything that might return him to the realm of the living. For weeks now, he had been trapped in an endless cycle of sleeplessness, the darkness a suffocating companion that gnawed away at his sanity. His mind had become a fog of endless tossing and turning, his body an unwilling slave to the throes of fatigue. After endless nights of staring at the ceiling and watching the slow crawl of time, his frustration boiled over. So, when he saw the advertisement in the local paper, "Join our sleep study for a chance at a life without insomnia. Safe, effective, transformative," he couldn't resist. The offer seemed too good to pass up. He was tired, desperate, willing to try anything. The study was being conducted at a state-of-the-art medical facility on the outskirts of town. The small, clinical building stood like a fortress, nestled in a grove of trees that shielded it from the outside world. Martin had been told the experiment was revolutionary. It promised to break the cycle of insomnia by tapping into the brain's deep sleep mechanisms. The scientists running the study, a team of neurologists, assured him that the process was safe, carefully monitored, and had shown promising results in preliminary trials. Still, there was something about the sterile whiteness of the place, the overly controlled atmosphere, that made him uneasy. But it was a small discomfort compared to the agony of sleeplessness that had consumed him for months. He needed this. He needed the chance to feel whole again. Martin's appointment was scheduled for the evening. When he arrived, the receptionist led him to a small room with nothing but a bed, a monitor, and a thick, padded chair. There was a sense of antiseptic efficiency in the way the room was arranged, almost clinical to the point of being disorienting. A nurse, who introduced herself as Clara, gave him a thick folder of forms to fill out. The forms asked a series of personal questions, most of them benign: medical history, sleep habits, stress levels. But there was one question that stopped Martin cold. "Have you ever had any unexplained experiences with your body or mind that you cannot fully explain?" He hesitated. What kind of question is that? He glanced at Clara, but she was focused on something else, not paying attention to the forms. He shrugged it off and answered the question as truthfully as he could. No, he hadn't had any unexplained experiences, at least none he could recall. Once the paperwork was finished, Clara led him to the bed and instructed him to lie down. She attached a series of electrodes to his head, murmuring instructions as she worked. The wires felt cold against his scalp, but he had little time to dwell on the discomfort. Soon, the lights were dimmed, and a soft hum filled the room, the sound of machinery operating quietly behind the scenes. "We're going to help you sleep, Mr. Hale," Clara said, her voice soft, almost hypnotic. "We'll give you the rest you deserve." With that, Martin felt the familiar tug of sleep beginning to take him, the darkness closing in around him, inviting him to escape from his weary mind. But this time, something was different. The sleep didn't come easily. Instead, a strange sensation lingered on the edge of his awareness, like a shadow that followed him into the depths of his mind. The first time Martin woke up, he wasn't sure what had happened. He opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the harsh lights of the room. The sound of the machines had stopped, and Clara was standing beside him, scribbling something on a clipboard. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice calm, clinical. I don't know," Martin replied, rubbing his eyes. He felt a strange sensation in his limbs, as though his body had been somewhere else. His muscles were stiff, his head foggy. But it wasn't the usual disorienting grogginess after a restless night. This felt different. Foreign. Clara smiled, reassuring him. "The procedure is complete. You're doing just fine. Your body has entered the deepest phase of sleep, something you haven't experienced in months. Martin tried to sit up, but the world around him seemed off. It was as though something was subtly wrong, like the furniture in the room had shifted, or perhaps the shadows seemed too sharp. "We'll monitor you for a bit longer," Clara said, gently pressing him back onto the bed. "You should rest. You're in good hands." He wanted to argue, to say he was fine. But the thick fog of sleep had already started to overtake him again. He closed his eyes, his body relaxing under the soft pressure of the sheets, and drifted off. The next time he woke, something was different. He wasn't in the same room. His surroundings were unfamiliar, and the bed beneath him felt wrong. He shot up, his heart racing, and looked around. He wasn't in the sterile sleep study room anymore. He was lying in a dark, dimly lit bedroom. The furniture was older, antique-looking, even. A tall dresser stood to his right, a mirror hanging above it, its surface cloudy with age. There was a faint scent of pine in the air, mixed with the faint odor of dust. Panic gripped him. His head was spinning, his thoughts foggy. What was happening? Where was he? He looked down at his hands. His fingers, his palms, they weren't his. They were older, rougher, with calluses that didn't belong to him. He glanced at the mirror and saw, not his own face. It was a stranger's face staring back at him, older than his own, with graying hair, a scar on the cheek, and a look of confusion in his eyes. He stumbled to his feet, his legs shaking as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. His reflection moved in sync with him, but it wasn't his reflection. It was the face of someone else. Where am I?" he muttered to himself, trying to steady his breathing. But his voice, it sounded off. Like it was coming from someone else entirely. He rushed to the door, swung it open, and staggered into a hallway. It was a long, dim corridor lined with portraits of people he didn't recognize. The house was old, far older than any place he had ever been. His heart pounded in his chest as his mind raced to understand what had happened. This wasn't just a bad dream. This wasn't the sleep study. He had woken up in someone else's life. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the echo of Martin's rapid footsteps as he moved down the unfamiliar hallway. His head throbbed, his thoughts scattered, and he struggled to make sense of what was happening. His mind told him one thing: he should still be in the sleep study, on that sterile bed with Clara by his side. But reality had shifted, warped into something altogether wrong. As he stumbled into the living room, he was greeted by the sight of a heavy leather couch, a glass coffee table, and thick, patterned curtains drawn against the windows. It wasn't the kind of place Martin would have ever chosen for himself. The furniture was old, well-worn, as though it had seen many years of use. And yet, it felt lived in, as though this was his space. He placed a hand on the couch, feeling the worn fabric beneath his fingertips. His pulse raced, and the realization hit him like a gut punch. This wasn't just a dream. He wasn't in a study. He wasn't in his own body. Everything had changed. And the man staring back at him in the mirror wasn't him at all. What the hell is going on? Martin muttered, his voice unfamiliar in his own ears. The man in the mirror was older, graying, with the wear and tear of a life lived much longer than his own 33 years. There was a deep scar on the side of his face, a mark that felt too real to be anything other than permanent. His hand shook as he reached up to touch his face. The skin was rough, uneven, the stubble more prominent than it should have been. The mirror reflected a stranger, an older version of a man who had lived a life Martin couldn't remember. This was not his body. These weren't his features. No. No, no, Martin whispered, his breath coming in short gasps. He stepped back from the mirror, his legs feeling weak beneath him. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. His heart skipped a beat. Martin's head jerked up at the sound of the knock. His pulse raced, the confusion and panic threatening to overwhelm him. Who would be at the door? Why was he in this house? And why had he woken up here, in this unfamiliar body? With trepidation, he approached the door, his mind a storm of questions. He reached for the handle and paused for a moment, his hand trembling. Then, taking a deep breath, he opened it. The man standing on the other side was tall, broad-shouldered, with a strong jawline and an air of authority about him. He was dressed in a suit, his dark eyes fixed on Martin with a strange, knowing expression. "Paul," the man said, his voice deep and firm. "You're up early today. Is everything okay?" Martin blinked, his mouth dry. I'm sorry. Do I know you?" he stammered, the words slipping from his mouth without thinking. The man's brow furrowed slightly, his lips twitching into a tight smile. "Come on, Paul, don't tell me you're having one of those days again." He shook his head and stepped inside, brushing past Martin as though he knew exactly where he was going. Martin's body froze in place. Paul? He didn't know anyone named Paul. Who is this man? Why is he calling me that? Before he could react, the man opened the door to what Martin assumed was the kitchen. He walked in like he owned the place, taking a seat at the table without waiting for an invitation. "Are you going to sit down or what?" the man said with a slight chuckle. "You're acting like you've just woken up from a coma or something. Are you feeling okay?" Martin hesitated, his mind racing. Everything about the situation felt wrong. This man, whoever he was treating him like they had known each other for years. The way he spoke, so casually, like nothing was out of the ordinary, made Martin's chest tighten with dread. The man didn't seem to notice anything strange. Taking a step into the kitchen, Martin nervously sat down across from the stranger, his body still trembling. His mind couldn't keep up with the events happening around him. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was going on. But as he opened his mouth to speak, the man beat him to it. "Paul," the man began, his voice soft but insistent, "you've been stressed lately. I know things have been tough, but we've been through worse before. You'll get through this. Just take it easy today." Martin's blood ran cold. This man was speaking as though he had known him, Paul, forever. But Martin wasn't Paul. He didn't know this man. He didn't even know who he was anymore. "I'm not Paul," Martin whispered, his voice cracking with fear. The man didn't even blink. "Of course you are," he replied, his tone patronizing, like he was speaking to a child. "We've been through this. We're family." But the word family sent a shiver down Martin's spine. This man wasn't family. This man was a stranger. And yet, the more he spoke, the more it felt like the words were seeping into Martin's very being, trying to rewrite his identity. The air in the room grew heavier, the walls closing in on him. He could feel his sense of self slipping away like sand through his fingers. As the day wore on, Martin's confusion deepened. He tried to leave the house, but every time he approached the door, his legs would falter, his body reluctant to move. Something was stopping him. The world outside felt distant, out of reach. It was as if the house had become a prison, one he couldn't escape. He walked through the rooms, trying to find anything that could explain what had happened. He opened drawers, cabinets, and closets, but there was nothing that seemed to make sense. Everything in the house seemed wrong. The personal items, the books, the photographs, they all belonged to someone else, someone who wasn't him. Then, as he walked past a large mirror in the hallway, he caught sight of himself once again. Paul. The name echoed in his head like a drumbeat. He was Paul. He had to be. This face, this body, it was his. But the man looking back at him in the mirror was a stranger, someone who had lived a life he couldn't remember. He could see the wear on the man's face, the lines that shouldn't have been there. The eyes that seemed too weary to belong to a man his age. The reflection began to distort, subtly at first. The face in the mirror flickered, as though it were a different person entirely. Paul was slipping away. He wasn't Paul. Before he could react, a voice whispered in the back of his mind, low and cold. "You're not Paul, Martin. You're not even you anymore." Martin's heart pounded in his chest as he turned away from the mirror. The walls seemed to close in on him. The house felt like it was suffocating him, wrapping around him like a deathly embrace. With trembling hands, Martin staggered toward the front door, desperate to escape. But when he reached for the handle, it refused to budge. He pulled harder, panic rising within him, but the door remained locked, as though it were holding him captive. And then, in the distance, he heard a sound, a low hum. It was coming from somewhere deep inside the house. It was the same hum he had heard in the sleep study. The sound was drawing him in, pulling him towards something he couldn't understand. "No, no," Martin whispered, his breath ragged. But it was too late. The door wouldn't open, and the hum grew louder, echoing in his skull. There was no escape. Not from the house. Not from the experiment. Not from the nightmare that was now his reality. The hum had grown louder, a relentless, penetrating sound that seemed to pulse through the walls and the very air around Martin. It was suffocating, like the heartbeat of the house itself, alive, breathing, closing in on him. His heart was racing as he stumbled away from the door, feeling the walls press in tighter, the darkness around him thickening with every passing second. Every step he took felt like it was leading him further into something he couldn't escape. Something that wasn't real. Something that was twisting his perception, bending his reality. He rushed through the house, his mind in chaos. He needed answers. He needed to understand what had happened, what had gone wrong. But everything around him felt like a trap, a labyrinth with no exit. He couldn't escape the feeling that the house was watching him, observing his every move, as if it was aware of his every thought, his every fear. "What am I doing here?" he thought, his mind grasping for clarity in the haze of confusion. "Why can't I remember anything?" His legs were shaky, his breath ragged. The house had become a maze, each room leading him deeper into darkness. He couldn't find the exit. He couldn't find anything that made sense. He glanced around at the walls, the photographs, the furniture. Nothing looked familiar. He wasn't even sure if the house was real anymore. It felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake from, a hallucination that had wrapped itself around his mind and wouldn't let go. "Paul," a voice said softly from behind him. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. The room was empty, the air still. But the voice lingered in his mind, cold and distant. Paul. It was the name he had been given. But it didn't feel like his name. It wasn't his identity. He was Martin Hale. He had always been Martin Hale. But now, it felt as if someone had erased him, had replaced him with this strange man. This body. His mind screamed in protest, but his body, this body, felt foreign, like an imposter. The walls seemed to close in again, the pressure building in his chest. He couldn't breathe. The hum was louder now, more insistent, vibrating through his bones. "Paul," the voice said again, and this time it was closer. It wasn't just in his head anymore. It was coming from somewhere, someone right behind him. With a burst of adrenaline, Martin rushed down the hallway, his eyes darting from side to side, searching for anything that would offer a clue, anything that would help him make sense of this madness. But as he turned the corner, he froze. There, at the end of the hall, stood a mirror. A large, full-length mirror. And in the reflection, standing perfectly still, was the man, the body he had woken up in. He was staring back at himself. Paul. But this wasn't him. This wasn't Martin Hale. The man in the mirror was older, his hair graying, his face lined with the signs of a life he couldn't remember living. His expression was calm, detached, almost as if he had known all along that this would happen. As if he had been waiting for Martin to wake up in his body. Martin's hand shook as he stepped closer to the mirror, his breath shallow. He reached out and touched the cold surface, and for a brief moment he expected the reflection to shatter, to break apart like the fragile illusion it was. But the glass remained solid, unmoving. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice barely a breath. The reflection in the mirror did not speak, but it did something far worse. It moved. The figure in the mirror raised its hand, slowly, deliberately. It mirrored Martin's own movements. But then, without warning, the reflection smiled. It was a sickening, twisted smile that didn't belong on a face that should have been a stranger to him. It was as if the man in the mirror was mocking him, taunting him. And then, the reflection spoke. "You're not Martin Hale," the reflection said, its voice low, unrecognizable. "You never were." Martin stumbled back, his heart racing in panic. No, this is me." He clutched at his chest, his breathing rapid, his mind reeling. "I'm Martin Hale. I'm not this man. I'm not Paul." The figure in the mirror tilted its head, its smile widening, as if amused by his desperation. "You're him now," it said softly. "You've always been him. You just didn't know it yet." The words were like daggers in Martin's chest. The reflection's eyes gleamed with a dark, knowing light, and for a moment, Martin swore he could see something else in the mirror, something watching him, lurking just behind the figure. He turned his back to the mirror, his legs unsteady beneath him. He had to leave. He had to get out of this place. But when he turned, he was face to face with the man, the stranger, who had knocked on the door earlier. "Paul," the man said again, his voice calm, but this time there was something darker in it. Something cold, like a warning. "I think it's time we talked." Martin's heart raced in his chest as the stranger stepped closer. There was something wrong with the way he moved, the way he knew things he shouldn't know. Every inch of Martin's body screamed to run, to escape, but his feet were rooted to the spot. "Who are you?" Martin demanded, his voice cracking with fear. He didn't know why, but he felt a deep sense of dread in the pit of his stomach. It was as though the man was pulling him into something he couldn't see, but he knew would swallow him whole. The stranger smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Just the cold, empty smile of someone who had seen too much. "I'm Edward," he said, his voice still soft, unhurried. "And you, Paul, are about to learn something about yourself that you won't like." The words hit Martin like a physical blow. "I'm not Paul," he shouted, his breath ragged, his mind struggling to keep up with the horror unfolding around him. "I'm Martin. You got it all wrong. I was part of an experiment. I... Edward's hand shot out suddenly, grabbing Martin's wrist with unnerving strength. "I know what you think," Edward said, his voice low and forceful. "But you've been asleep for a long time, Paul. Long enough for us to work our magic." Martin tried to pull away, but it was useless. Edward's grip tightened, and the world around him seemed to tilt. The walls seemed to bend, the air growing heavier with every breath. "What are you talking about?" Martin gasped, his pulse hammering in his ears. Edward's smile grew darker, and his eyes gleamed with something otherworldly. "The experiment isn't just about curing insomnia," he said, his voice cold as ice. "It's about control. About taking what's not yours and giving what you've never known. You've been asleep for a long time, Paul. But now you're awake." And in that moment, as the last vestiges of reality crumbled around him, Martin understood. He wasn't just part of the experiment. He was the experiment. And now he was trapped in a body that wasn't his own. The man in the mirror wasn't a stranger, he was Paul. And Paul had been taken, erased. And now it was too late. The doors of his past had been locked, and he was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The last thing Martin saw before the world went black was Edward's face, grinning with a knowing darkness that filled him with a deep, unshakable terror. When Martin regained consciousness, he didn't know how long he had been out. His head throbbed with a dull ache, and the room around him was eerily silent. He could taste the sharp metallic tang of fear in his mouth, and when he tried to sit up, his body felt heavy, foreign, sluggish. The bed beneath him was soft, the sheets tangled around his legs. He closed his eyes and took in a long, slow breath, his chest tight, as if something was pressing down on him from all sides. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic, like a hospital. But it wasn't a hospital. It couldn't be. When his eyes opened, he saw the man again, Edward. He was standing in the corner of the room, watching him with that same eerie smile. The look in his eyes was sharp, predatory. It felt like Edward was waiting for something, waiting for Martin to understand. "Welcome back, Paul," Edward said softly, his voice low, carrying an unsettling calmness. How does it feel to finally wake up? Martin felt a chill run down his spine as he forced himself to sit up, the strange sense of wrongness still clouding his thoughts. This was it. This was the moment. He had to understand what was happening. He had to escape. "You're still in there, aren't you?" Edward continued, as if reading Martin's thoughts. "But you know, it doesn't matter. You've been awake for a long time. You're Paul now. There's no going back." Martin's mind was a mess, spinning in a whirlwind of confusion. "I'm Martin Hale," he thought desperately, clutching the sides of the bed. "I'm not Paul. This isn't me." But the more he thought about it, the more it felt like he wasn't sure anymore. The memories, the ones that were his, were starting to fade, slipping away like smoke. There was only the overwhelming sense of Paul, this other man's life, pressing against him. His reflection in the mirror was a stranger's face, and yet it was becoming familiar, a part of him. "You don't even remember, do you?" Edward's voice broke through Martin's thoughts, sharp and biting. "You were never supposed to be Martin Hale. You were always Paul." Martin's heart raced in his chest as he forced himself to stand. His legs felt weak, unsteady, but he fought against the sensation. He had to get out. He had to escape this twisted reality. But the room around him didn't make sense. The walls seemed to bend and shift, the lights flickering in and out like they were caught in a glitch. The hum from earlier, was back, thrumming in the back of his mind like the beating of some unseen heart. It was louder now, as if the house itself was alive, pulsating with a life of its own. Martin moved toward the door, but when he reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. He pulled at it, panicked, but it was as if the door was locked from the other side, or perhaps something was holding it shut. "No escape," Edward said, his voice chillingly calm. "This is your reality now, Paul. You wanted to sleep, but you never thought about what waking up would cost." Martin turned, desperate now, his gaze searching the room for an answer. But everything felt distorted, unreal. He ran his hands through his hair, trying to calm the storm inside his head. His reflection still haunted him. It was like a piece of himself had been ripped away, leaving only fragments. Was it the experiment? Was it the sleep study that had done this to him? "I'm not Paul," Martin gasped, the words thick in his throat. "I'm not Paul." Edward didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge the desperation in Martin's voice. Instead, he stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving Martin's face. "It doesn't matter, Paul," Edward said softly, his voice like a serpent's hiss. "You're part of something bigger now. You've crossed over. You're living the life you were meant to live." Martin stumbled backward, panic flooding his veins. "Living the life I was meant to live?" The words made no sense. They were empty, hollow. But as he turned again, facing the mirror, the truth settled on him like a heavy weight. The reflection didn't change. It didn't distort. It was Paul now. Paul's eyes stared back at him, full of sadness, regret, and acceptance. Martin's body shook as the walls seemed to pulse, the air thickening with the weight of it all. His pulse quickened as he backed away from the mirror. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." As Martin struggled to comprehend what had just happened, a strange sensation washed over him, like a wave that slowly crept over his body. It wasn't just a memory of someone else's life. It wasn't just that he wasn't Martin Hale. It was as though his entire sense of self, his soul, was being overwritten, replaced with the thoughts and experiences of Paul. His head spun as images began to flood his mind, memories that weren't his, faces that weren't familiar. He saw a woman, beautiful and smiling, her face warm and inviting, in a house, a real house, where he had once lived. He saw children playing outside, a dog in the yard, and the sound of laughter filling the air. The life Paul had lived was playing out in front of him, and it was starting to feel like it had always been his. "I know you're confused," Edward's voice broke through the chaos. "It's like an eraser has been run over your mind. But don't worry. It's all here. It's always been here. You just need to remember." Martin gasped, clutching his head. "Stop it. I don't want this. I'm not Paul." But the memories didn't stop. They continued to unfold, flooding his mind like a broken dam. He could feel the love, the pain, the choices Paul had made, choices that were now becoming his own. They were his now, locked in his body, like chains he couldn't break free of. His chest tightened as the room began to spin. I can't, Martin gasped, feeling the deepening darkness swallowing him. Edward's face was the last thing he saw before his vision blurred entirely, and the hum in his mind grew louder, as if the walls were closing in. When Martin finally regained consciousness, he was no longer in the same room. The sterile, clinical environment of the sleep study was gone, replaced by something familiar, but wrong. He was standing in the middle of the living room, facing the window. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. There was a familiar warmth to the room, but also a lingering sense of dread that gnawed at his insides. It was his house. Paul's house. He felt it deep in his bones. The life he had tried to reject was now inescapable. The memories, the thoughts, everything he had tried to run from had become part of him. He had become Paul, and Paul had become him. As he looked down at his hands, his fingers trembling, he saw the man's life playing out in the lines of his skin, in the wrinkles on his face. He had aged in a way that didn't make sense, as though he had lived decades of experiences that weren't his to begin with. He was no longer Martin Hale. He was Paul. And there was no way back. The doorbell rang. It was soft at first, a quiet sound that reverberated through the house. Martin, Paul, stumbled toward the door, his legs heavy, as if they had already been walked 1,000 miles. When he opened it, a woman stood on the other side. She was smiling, her face warm, but her eyes were filled with a knowing sadness. "Paul," she said gently, "you're home now." And as the door closed behind her, and the last remnants of Martin Hale faded into the past, Paul stepped into his own life, fully aware of the truth. There was no escape from the sleep study. Story 4. Dr. Thomas Archer had always been fascinated by the mind. For years, he had dedicated his career to studying the intricacies of the human psyche, how memories formed, how emotions played a role in cognition, and how the mind could be both an ally and an enemy to its owner. But it wasn't until the day he stumbled upon the theory of fear that his research took a dark turn. It had started as an innocent curiosity. He had been working late in the lab, combing through old psychological studies when he discovered something peculiar, an obscure paper detailing experiments on the human fear response. At first, it seemed like just another failed study, but as Thomas read further, a spark of interest ignited in him. The paper suggested that fear, when experienced in extreme amounts, could be separated from the mind and contained. Trapping fear, rather than allowing it to linger or fade away, was the key. The implications were staggering. Fear, as it turned out, was more than just an emotion, it was an energy, a force that could be manipulated. For weeks, Thomas couldn't shake the idea. The more he thought about it, the more obsessed he became. What if he could truly collect fear? What if he could harness its power? The possibilities were endless. He could study it, analyze it, perhaps even use it as a tool for psychological treatment. But there was something else, something darker, that gnawed at him. What would happen if fear was released? Thomas wasted no time. In the confines of his private lab, hidden away from the prying eyes of the university and colleagues who would never understand, he set to work. He began designing a machine, something that would allow him to extract the fear from the human mind. He called it the fear collector. The process was complicated. First, Thomas needed volunteers, willing participants who could withstand the intense psychological pressure of being subjected to fear-inducing stimuli. He wasn't sure if it would work, but he was determined to find out. He already secured funding through various grants under the guise of studying extreme emotional responses. The first volunteer was a young man named Eric, a graduate student who had been struggling with anxiety. Eric had agreed to participate after Thomas assured him it would help with his personal issues. The idea of removing fear from the mind seemed like a noble cause, and Eric had no idea the horrors that would follow. The machine was a grotesque creation of wires, screens, and electrodes. It stood tall in the center of the lab, its metallic surface cold and uninviting. At first glance, it resembled a large chair, but upon closer inspection, the intricate setup of sensors and cables was anything but comforting. Eric sat in the chair, his face pale, his eyes wide with anticipation. He had no idea what was about to happen, but the promise of freedom from his crippling fear was enough to calm his nerves. "Are you ready, Eric?" Thomas asked, his voice almost too calm, too controlled. Eric nodded, his hands gripping the armrests. "Yeah, let's do this." Thomas activated the machine, and a low hum filled the air. The room grew colder as the screens flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow that illuminated the otherwise dark space. The machine was reading Eric's brainwaves, identifying patterns of stress, anxiety, and fear. Thomas watched intently, his breath shallow with excitement. This was it. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. The machine did its work, drawing out the fear from Eric's mind. Thomas could see the readings fluctuate on the screen, an increase in the electrical activity followed by a sudden, sharp dip. Fear was being extracted, absorbed by the machine, contained in a small, transparent container at the side of the room. The fear itself looked like nothing more than a swirling, inky black mist, pulsing within the confines of the jar. For a moment, Thomas couldn't believe his eyes. He had done it. The machine had worked. Eric's fear, the very thing that had plagued him for years, was now contained. The man in the chair seemed different, calmer, less twitchy. As the last remnants of fear left his body, his breathing slowed, and his eyes relaxed. Thomas felt a strange sense of triumph mixed with a twinge of unease. "How do you feel?" Thomas asked, approaching the chair. Eric blinked as if waking from a deep sleep. I feel lighter. I don't feel anxious anymore." Thomas smiled. The first success. But there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Something wasn't right. The container holding Eric's fear began to shimmer, its contents swirling violently inside, as if it were struggling to break free. Thomas watched, his excitement quickly shifting to unease as the mist inside seemed to expand, pressing against the glass. "What's happening?" Thomas whispered under his breath, taking a step back. Eric, still groggy from the procedure, looked at the container and then back at Thomas. His face twisted with concern. "What's in that thing?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Nothing," Thomas said quickly, trying to dismiss the growing tension. "Just a minor fluctuation. It's normal." But it wasn't normal. The fear inside the container was growing, pushing against the confines of the glass. It began to emit a faint, low growl, a sound that chilled Thomas to his core. Before he could react, the container shattered, its glass exploding into tiny shards that scattered across the room. The fear, the inky black mist, spilled out, swirling around the room like a living entity, expanding rapidly. "No!" Thomas shouted, but it was too late. The fear didn't wait. It didn't hesitate. It rushed toward the walls, swirling and twisting, filling the room with a deep, suffocating presence. It moved with purpose, as if it had a mind of its own. The air grew thick, oppressive, as the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Eric screamed, his body convulsing as he was hit by the raw intensity of the fear he had just experienced. His face contorted in terror as the mist seemed to wrap around him, pressing on his chest. "Stop!" Thomas shouted, but the words felt powerless against the storm that had been unleashed. The fear was everywhere, filling the space, distorting everything it touched. The room seemed to shift, the walls warping and bending as the fear poured out of the container. The lights flickered, casting long, sinister shadows that seemed to chase them. It was like a nightmare come to life, a living, breathing entity of pure terror. Eric's screams echoed through the lab as the fear grew stronger. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the mist began to retreat. It faded into the corners of the room, pulling back like a tide receding, leaving Thomas alone with the wreckage of his failed experiment. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas stood in the center of the room, his heart hammering in his chest. His mind raced, his thoughts chaotic. He had thought he could control fear. He had believed he could trap it, study it, and use it for good. But now, it was free. And he had no idea what consequences awaited him. Eric lay unconscious in the chair, his body limp, his face pale. Thomas approached him cautiously, kneeling beside him. His breath caught in his throat as he realized the man was no longer breathing. The fear, the thing they had trapped, had claimed him. But that was only the beginning. The door to the lab slammed shut with a deafening bang. Thomas turned, his pulse quickening, as the fear he had collected began to swirl around him again. This time, it wasn't going to be contained. Thomas stood frozen in place, his eyes locked on the empty space where the fear had once been contained. The shattered glass from the container lay scattered on the floor, but the mist, the terrible, inky black mist had already faded into the air. It was gone, but not really. It had seeped into the walls, the corners of the room, the very fabric of the building itself. Eric's lifeless body was slumped in the chair, pale and still, and Thomas's stomach twisted with guilt. He hadn't meant for this to happen. All he had wanted to do was study fear, to understand it, control it. But now, the very thing he had sought to tame had slipped from his grasp. The hum that had filled the lab before was gone, replaced by a suffocating silence. But beneath that silence, there was something else, a low, almost imperceptible growl that seemed to vibrate the air around him. Thomas could feel it in his bones, deep inside, like an insidious presence that was watching, waiting. He reached for Eric's shoulder, shaking him gently, but the man didn't stir. Panic surged in his chest as he checked for a pulse. Nothing. The fear, whatever it was, had taken more than just his consciousness. It had taken his life. What have I done? Thomas whispered, his voice shaking. He stepped back, almost stumbling in his rush to get away from the body. His mind was racing, but it couldn't keep up with the horror unfolding around him. This was just the beginning. Thomas tried to breathe deeply, to think rationally, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. What had he unleashed? How could something as intangible as fear have such power? It was then that he heard it, the sound of something moving, slithering in the darkness. He turned quickly, his heart in his throat, but there was nothing there. The lab was still, except for the air. The air felt thick, heavy with something unnameable. The growl returned, this time louder, more defined. It was coming from the far side of the room, from behind the large equipment and stacks of papers. Thomas strained to listen, his heartbeat quickening as the noise grew louder, as if something was scraping against the floor. "Who's there?" Thomas called out, his voice rising in panic. There was no answer, only the sound of movement. The walls seemed to close in around him, the shadows creeping along the edges of the room, stretching longer than they should. The lab, once a place of calm and order, now felt alive in a way that terrified him. Suddenly, the growl turned into a roar. It was deafening, echoing through the lab like an animal in pain. Thomas's knees nearly buckled beneath him as the air grew colder, a sharp, biting chill that crawled up his spine. He could feel something shifting in the darkness. Something massive, something powerful, moving just beyond his reach. His breath came in ragged gasps as he backed away, but his legs refused to carry him fast enough. He stumbled, his mind racing with only one thought: he needed to get out. He grabbed for the door handle, his hand shaking violently, but the door refused to open. It was locked. The noise was growing louder now, a constant, pulsating growl, like something trapped and desperate. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A shadow, dark and undulating, shifting in the corner where the fear had once been contained. It was moving slowly, creeping forward with a malevolent grace. He watched in horror as the shadow began to take shape, solidifying into something vaguely human, but not quite. It was a form of terror itself, a creature made of the very fear it had fed on. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed a deep, fiery red. Its mouth stretched wide, a grin of pure malice, filled with teeth that seemed to stretch on forever. The creature's body was jagged, shifting like a pile of ash in the wind, its edges constantly warping and changing, as if the fear that created it was unstable. But there was no mistaking it. It was alive, and it was looking directly at Thomas. "No!" Thomas gasped, taking a step back, his breath quick and shallow. The creature took another step toward him, its form rippling with an unnatural energy. The air seemed to grow even colder, as if the very essence of life was being sucked away, leaving nothing but emptiness. "You freed me," the creature whispered, its voice distorted, echoing in Thomas's mind. Thomas's chest tightened as he realized the horror of what he had done. The fear he had collected, trapped inside the machine, was no longer just an emotion. It had become real. It had taken on a life of its own. And it was hungry. Thomas could feel the weight of the fear pressing in on him, suffocating him. His mind raced, but there was no escape. The creature moved closer, its eyes never leaving his face, its body warping and undulating with every step. "You can't control me," the creature growled, its voice shaking the room. "You think you can trap fear? You think you can control me?" The room seemed to spin as the creature's presence grew stronger. The growl deepened into a low, guttural roar that rattled the walls. The lights flickered, casting eerie, erratic shadows around the room. "I was never meant to be contained," it hissed. "I am eternal. I am fear. I will consume everything in my path." Thomas took another step back, his legs trembling, his mind a chaotic swirl of thoughts. He had to get out. He had to stop the creature before it could do more damage. But his body refused to move. It was as though the fear itself had paralyzed him, holding him in place. The creature raised its hand, long, clawed fingers reaching for him. The air around Thomas grew impossibly thick, like he was breathing through water, and he could feel the weight of the fear pressing down on him. Just as the creature's claws reached for him, Thomas snapped out of his trance. With a surge of adrenaline, he lunged for the door, slamming his shoulder into it with all his strength. The door rattled, but it didn't open. "Let me out!" Thomas screamed, his voice hoarse with panic. The creature's laughter filled the room, a sound that made Thomas's skin crawl. "You can't escape," it whispered. "I'm inside you now. You freed me, and now you'll carry me forever." As Thomas struggled against the door, he realized the true horror of what he had done. The fear wasn't just contained inside the machine, it had become part of him. It had followed him, clinging to his soul, and now it was free. It would never leave. The door finally gave way with a loud crash, and Thomas stumbled into the hallway. But the fear was still there, following him, filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. He didn't know where to run. The creature was everywhere, and it was coming for him. With his heart pounding in his chest, Thomas ran down the corridor, the sound of the creature's growls growing louder in his ears. The fear was chasing him. It had been set loose, and there was no way to stop it. Thomas ran blindly through the halls of the facility, the sound of his footsteps pounding in his ears. His breath came in ragged gasps as he rounded corners, stumbling over his own feet. The creature was close, he could feel it, its presence like a shadow over his every step, moving with him, mirroring his every turn. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know how to escape. His mind was a blur of fear and panic, every rational thought swallowed by the overwhelming dread that gripped him. The creature, the manifestation of pure fear, was out there, and it was hunting him. He could almost feel its breath on the back of his neck, its clawed hands reaching toward him, waiting to tear him apart. He didn't dare look back. He couldn't. He had seen its eyes, glowing red and burning with malice, and it was that image that haunted him now, pressing against the edges of his consciousness. The creature had been born from the very thing he had tried to control. It was fear personified, and now it was free. It had no boundaries, no limits, and it was relentless. He burst through a door, slamming it behind him, and found himself in a small, dimly lit storage room. The door rattled as something slammed against it from the other side, a thudding sound that made his blood run cold. He knew it wouldn't hold long. The fear would break through, just like it had broken through the lab. It was only a matter of time. Thomas's hands shook as he fumbled for his phone. He needed to call for help, but the screen was cracked, and when he tried to dial, the words blurred before his eyes. His mind felt fractured, like he was losing touch with reality. The fear had taken root, and now it was spreading, infecting everything in its path. The more he tried to push it away, the closer it got. And then it came to him, he was part of it now. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the creature that had been released. It was his own fear. The thing he had trapped, the thing he had studied, it had latched onto him, using his own mind as a vessel. He had been the one to create it. He had been the one to free it. The room seemed to close in on him as the weight of his actions pressed down on his shoulders. His breathing grew heavier, more labored, as if the very air around him was suffocating him. The walls seemed to pulse, undulating like they were alive. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted, stretching long and thin, crawling toward him. He was trapped. Trapped by his own creation. The fear had already taken hold of the building, spreading through the ventilation system, creeping into the walls, the floors, the very foundations of the place. There was no place to hide from it. It was everywhere. And it was growing stronger. No, no, Thomas whispered to himself, his voice shaking as he backed into the corner of the room. I have to fix this. I have to stop it. But the truth was, he didn't know how. There was no stopping the fear now. No way to contain it. He had unleashed it, and now it was out in the world. It was hungry. It was alive. And it wanted to consume everything. He could feel it crawling beneath his skin, the dread worming its way deeper into his mind. His thoughts were fragmented, slipping away, the lines between reality and nightmare blurring. He had created something that should never have existed. A loud bang echoed from the hallway outside the room. The door shook again, and Thomas knew that the creature was close, too close. He could hear it now, its growls low and guttural, vibrating through the walls, like it was getting closer with every breath. But then, just as quickly as the noise began, it stopped. Thomas froze. The silence was deafening. His pulse pounded in his ears, and he held his breath, straining to listen. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. And then, he heard it, the sound of something moving, slow and deliberate, right outside the door. The creature was toying with him. It was waiting. Suddenly, the door swung open with a violent crash. Thomas barely had time to react before a blast of cold air hit him, followed by a wave of fear so intense it nearly knocked him to his knees. His vision blurred, and the walls of the room seemed to melt away as the creature's form emerged from the shadows. It was like a living nightmare. Its body was fluid, shifting, its features constantly changing, warping as if it couldn't decide what it was. The glowing red eyes locked onto him, unblinking, and its mouth stretched wide, revealing rows upon rows of teeth. "You shouldn't have tried to control me," it hissed, its voice like 1,000 whispers. "You're mine now, Thomas. Forever." The creature lunged at him with terrifying speed, its claws reaching for his throat. But before it could touch him, Thomas stumbled backward, his mind scrambling for a way out. He bolted toward the far corner of the room, his legs carrying him with frantic energy as his thoughts raced. He had to escape. He had to find a way to stop this nightmare. He reached the window, his hands fumbling for the latch. His heart was pounding in his chest as he tore it open, the cold night air rushing into the room. Without thinking, he climbed through the window and dropped to the ground below, his body hitting the grass with a sickening thud. The creature's roars echoed in the distance, but Thomas didn't look back. He didn't dare. He ran. He ran with everything he had, his feet pounding against the earth, his mind consumed with the terror of what he had unleashed. The fear was everywhere now, spreading through the world, infecting everything it touched. And there was no way to stop it. As Thomas stumbled through the darkened streets, his body exhausted and trembling, the weight of his failure crashed down on him. He had been so obsessed with controlling fear, with understanding it, that he had lost sight of something much more important, the consequences. He had unleashed something that couldn't be contained. He had created something that could never be put back. The streets were empty, eerily quiet, as if the whole world had gone silent in anticipation. The city around him seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. But Thomas knew, deep in his bones, that the fear was already out there. It was growing, spreading like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. It was too late. It had already begun. And now, it was hunting him. The truth was undeniable. The fear hadn't just escaped the lab, it had taken root in his mind, in his soul. And the worst part? He could still feel it. The creature. The fear. It was still with him. And it would never let him go. Thomas had no idea how long he had been running. Hours, maybe days. Time had become a blur, an abstract concept that no longer seemed to matter. His body was raw from exhaustion, his limbs heavy, his thoughts fractured and disjointed. The world around him felt unreal, like he was moving through a fog, unable to grasp anything solid, everything slipping through his fingers. The fear was with him, constantly, a presence pressing against his chest, suffocating him with every breath he took. It wasn't just the creature anymore. It wasn't just the shadow that had haunted him in the lab. The fear had become something deeper, more insidious. It was his fear now. His guilt. His horror. His failure. The realization of what he had unleashed was slowly consuming him from the inside out. He had tried to outrun it. He had tried to escape the terror that had taken hold of the world, but it was everywhere. The fear was like a shadow following him, suffocating the life out of everything it touched. The city had fallen into chaos. People ran through the streets, their faces twisted in panic, their eyes wide with terror. It was like the entire world had been infected, transformed by the same darkness he had brought into existence. Thomas staggered through the streets, the noise of the city around him a distant hum. The buildings loomed like sentinels, dark and oppressive. The streets were empty, save for the occasional figure stumbling in the distance, consumed by the same fear that haunted him. He could feel it now, creeping up his spine, the presence of the creature, the fear that had been released into the world. It was following him, drawing closer with every step. It had taken root in his mind, in his soul, and now it was going to finish what it had started. Thomas reached the edge of the city, the skyline disappearing behind him as he walked deeper into the woods. The air was thick with mist, and the trees seemed to close in on him, their branches reaching like long, skeletal fingers. The world around him had become a nightmare, a place where nothing was safe, nothing was real. He had tried to make sense of it all, but there was no sense to be made. The fear was too powerful. It was unstoppable. It had become a part of him, woven into the fabric of his being. And now, he was its prisoner. The sound of footsteps broke through his thoughts. Slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. He didn't need to turn around to know what it was. He had felt it closing in on him for days. The creature was here, in the woods with him. It was ready to claim him, to finish what it had started. Thomas's breath hitched as he turned, and there it was, standing in the shadows, its red eyes gleaming with malice. The creature was more monstrous now, its body shifting and warping, taking on a form that was both human and inhuman. Its features were twisted, a grotesque parody of a man, a face filled with hunger and rage. "You can't escape me," it whispered, its voice like the scratching of nails on glass. "You belong to me now." Thomas took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the fear rising inside him again, choking him, suffocating him with every breath. It was as if the creature had become part of the very air he breathed. "No, no, I won't let you win," Thomas gasped, his voice trembling. The creature stepped forward, its form flickering like a bad signal, its outline blurry, distorting with each movement. It reached out toward him, its claws scraping the air. "You can't fight me, Thomas," the creature hissed. "I am you. You are me. We are one." The words sent a shock through Thomas, freezing him in place. The creature's grip on his mind was complete. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was his identity, his very soul that had been consumed by the thing he had created. His knees gave out beneath him, and he fell to the ground, trembling. The creature was right. There was no escaping it. It had become a part of him, and now it would consume him completely. The air around him grew heavier, the trees pressing him like they were alive, closing him in. The growl of the creature echoed in his ears, a sound that reverberated through his bones. The fear was here, in full force, and it was claiming him. Thomas closed his eyes, surrendering to the inevitable. He could feel the creature's presence seeping into him, flooding his mind with darkness. The fear had taken root in his soul, and now it was devouring him. There was no fighting it. There was no escaping it. "Please, stop," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't know." But the creature didn't stop. It only grew stronger, the darkness swallowing him whole. The trees around him seemed to bend and warp, their branches twisting like fingers reaching for him. The world was collapsing into itself, a nightmare that had no end. And then, as the fear consumed him completely, Thomas heard a voice, a whisper, faint and distant. But it wasn't the creature's voice. It was something else. A soft, gentle voice, as if it had always been there, waiting. You can still stop it, Thomas. You can still undo what you've done. The voice was like a light in the darkness, a sliver of hope in the suffocating nightmare. Thomas gasped, his heart pounding in his chest as the voice reached him through the fog of fear. It was his own voice, but it sounded distant, as though it was coming from somewhere far away. What can I do?" he asked, his voice shaking with desperation. "You have to face it," the voice whispered. "You have to confront the fear within you." Thomas felt the presence of the creature growing stronger, but there was something else now. His voice, was urging him to fight, to confront the darkness that had taken hold of him. He stood up, his legs shaking, and turned to face the creature. It was still there, its form twisted and monstrous, its eyes glowing with rage. But Thomas no longer felt the overwhelming terror that had once consumed him. The fear, though still present, was no longer in control. "I will stop you," Thomas said, his voice steady. The fear was still there, but he had finally realized that it was part of him. It was a part of the human condition, something everyone faced. It was only when he accepted it, when he confronted it head-on, that he could begin to fight back. The creature let out a low growl, its form flickering as if it was struggling to hold onto its shape. It knew it was losing its grip. With a final, desperate surge of willpower, Thomas reached out and touched the creature's chest. And in that moment, everything changed. The fear that had consumed him began to dissipate, leaving only emptiness in its wake. The creature let out a final, agonizing scream, its form collapsing into a cloud of smoke and dust. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The forest was quiet again. The mist had lifted, and the air felt lighter, less oppressive. Thomas stood alone in the clearing, his heart still racing, but the overwhelming weight of fear had lifted. The nightmare was over, at least for now. But as he looked around, he realized that the world hadn't returned to normal. It had been changed. The fear, once contained, was now free. It would take time for the world to heal from the darkness he had unleashed. And as Thomas walked back toward the city, he knew that he would never be free from the memory of what he had created. Fear was part of him now, part of the world. It could never be erased. It would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next person to come along and try to control it. The fear had been collected, but it could never be fully contained.
Story 5. Ethan Rowe had never been a man who believed in fate. He was a practical man, a man of reason, a man who believed in science and logic. But as he walked down the bustling street on a chilly October evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. It wasn't just the usual weariness of his long workday or the steady hum of the city that filled the air. There was something different today, something that gnawed at him, like a presence just out of sight, waiting to make itself known. As he passed the corner coffee shop, his eyes briefly caught the reflection of a woman standing inside. She was sitting at one of the tables by the window, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her eyes hidden behind a pair of thick sunglasses. She wasn't doing anything particularly unusual, just sipping her coffee, seemingly lost in thought, but something about her presence felt unsettling. It was the way she seemed to be watching him, even though their eyes had never met. Shaking the feeling off, Ethan pushed through the door of his apartment building, the warm air from the hallway wrapping around him like a blanket. But as he turned the corner to the elevator, the strange sensation lingered, creeping into his thoughts. He wasn't a superstitious man, but the feeling he couldn't shake gnawed at him, whispering that something wasn't right. He pressed the button for the elevator, trying to dismiss the thought. "It's just the stress," he muttered to himself, stepping into the small, dimly lit elevator. The doors closed behind him with a soft click. It wasn't until later that night that Ethan realized just how unsettling the whole experience had been. After a quick dinner and a couple of hours of mindless television, he decided to get some sleep. He had a long day ahead tomorrow, and the early mornings always left him feeling like a shell of himself. But as he settled into his bed, the feeling from earlier crept back, this time stronger, more insistent. His eyes flicked toward the dark window of his bedroom, and that was when he saw her again. The woman. She was standing across the street, just beneath the street lamp, her silhouette stark against the city's glow. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest. He blinked, trying to shake the image, but when he looked again, she was still there. He could feel her gaze fixed on him. He tried to reason it away. It's probably just some late-night jogger or someone waiting for a cab, he thought, but that nagging feeling, no, certainty, grew stronger. His hand shot out for the blinds, but the woman was gone by the time he drew them open. The street outside was empty, the light of the street lamp casting long, eerie shadows across the sidewalk. He felt a sudden rush of cold air, though the room had been warm just moments before. With a deep breath, Ethan pushed the curtains back in place and turned to crawl back into bed. But the sense of unease lingered, settled deep in his bones. He told himself to relax, but the thoughts kept bubbling up. Why was she watching me? How did she know? The next morning, Ethan pushed aside his lingering unease and went about his daily routine. Work. Coffee. The same repetitive motions that marked the start of his day. He had forgotten about the strange woman, or at least tried to forget, by the time he left his apartment for his usual morning walk. But as he approached the corner where he had seen her the night before, he saw her again. The woman. She was standing at the same coffee shop, right where she had been the day before, sitting by the window, only this time her eyes were visible. And this time, they were fixed directly on him. Ethan stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze around him. The sounds of the street, the hum of passing cars, the chatter of people all faded away. All he could see was her, sitting there, staring at him like she knew something he didn't. She tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into a small, knowing smile. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, and his instinct was to turn around and walk away. But he couldn't move. He felt rooted to the spot, trapped by her gaze. Slowly, against his better judgment, he stepped inside the coffee shop. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, and the barista greeted him with a nod, but Ethan's focus remained on the woman at the window. She hadn't broken her gaze. It was as though she was waiting for him. "May I sit here?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. The woman didn't respond with words. She simply patted the seat next to her, a silent invitation that seemed both welcoming and unnerving. Reluctantly, Ethan took the seat across from her. The smell of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, but it did little to calm his racing thoughts. "You've been seeing me a lot lately," she said, her voice low, almost soothing. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, one that sent a chill down his spine. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could she know? He had never met her before. Never seen her in his life. Don't be alarmed, she continued, her voice as soft as a whisper. I know you. The words hit him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth again, his heart racing, but he could barely form a sentence. His mind was spinning. How could she possibly know him? His deepest secrets, his private thoughts, were being laid bare in front of him as though she had known them for years. You're wondering how I know you, she said, as if reading his mind. But it's not how you think. You don't remember me, but I remember you. I've known you for a long time. Thomas's pulse quickened. Who is she? The woman smiled again, this time more knowingly, as if she was enjoying the confusion on his face. And just as quickly as it had come, the feeling of terror, of helplessness, gripped him again. But it wasn't just fear, it was the cold, undeniable certainty that he had encountered her before, somewhere. But where? Ethan barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the woman's face flashed in his mind, those deep, knowing eyes, the smile that seemed to hold some hidden secret. She had said she knew him. The words had rattled around in his skull like a persistent echo, bouncing off the walls of his consciousness. How? Why? When he woke up the next morning, it felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. The world didn't feel quite as solid anymore. The coffee shop, her presence, and the cryptic words she had spoken, everything seemed like it was creeping in, pushing against him from every angle. He didn't know what to do next. He hadn't meant to get involved. He just wanted to go about his life, to forget this strange encounter and move on. But the more he tried to push it away, the more the woman's words, those quiet, unsettling words, chased him. After some internal debate, Ethan finally decided he had to confront the situation. If she knew him, if she knew things no one else could possibly know, then there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was all some kind of sick joke, or perhaps she was just a con artist preying on his confusion. But he couldn't shake the fear that there was something more, something darker, lurking beneath the surface. So, he went back to the coffee shop. It was the same time as the day before, around noon, when Ethan entered the coffee shop again. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, though it was only him and a couple of other patrons inside. His eyes immediately scanned the room, but there she was, sitting by the window, just as before, the sunglasses perched on her face. But this time, as he stepped toward her, she didn't look up. She didn't even acknowledge his presence, and a part of him wondered if she was waiting for him to approach her. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then walked toward the table, his hands trembling as he pulled out a chair. He didn't say anything immediately. Instead, he sat there, watching her. A few moments passed, and she still didn't acknowledge him. You know, Ethan finally began, his voice shaky but determined, I'm not sure why you've been following me, but you're starting to freak me out. I don't know you. I don't remember you. The woman lifted her head slowly, her dark eyes hidden behind the sunglasses. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but there was an unsettling calmness to it that sent a chill down his spine. I know, she said. You don't remember. But I do. And that's enough for now. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, a cold shiver running down his spine. She's playing with me, he thought. She's trying to get inside my head. How do you know me? Ethan demanded, his voice louder now. Tell me, because I'm seriously starting to lose my mind here. She didn't answer at first. Instead, she took a long sip from her coffee, her gaze never leaving him. Ethan felt himself growing more impatient, more desperate for answers. I've been waiting for you, she said, her voice almost too calm. I know everything about you. Your secrets, your fears, everything. Ethan felt a strange lump form in his throat. His hands clenched into fists on the table. What does she mean by that? He thought, his heart racing. You've been living with the idea of knowing who you are, she continued, her voice laced with something unreadable. But there are things you've hidden from yourself. Things you don't even remember. Ethan's mind was spinning. What is she talking about? What have I forgotten? He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. This is insane, he shouted, his voice rising. You don't know me. You can't possibly know me. I don't know who you are or why you're doing this, but you need to stop. Her eyes followed him as he moved toward the door, but she didn't stop him. Her face remained expressionless, the same calm, unsettling look that had sent a shiver down his spine the first time he'd seen her. I don't need to prove anything to you, she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. You'll remember soon enough. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That conversation, those words, had cracked something open inside him. He didn't understand it, but there was an underlying current of truth in her voice. As he walked back to his apartment, he noticed that the world seemed to have shifted again. People in the street moved in slow motion, their faces blending together into an indistinguishable blur. The sounds around him became muffled, like he was underwater. His thoughts raced, but his head felt like it was full of static. Back in his apartment, he sat in the dark, the only light coming from the flickering lamp beside him. He opened his laptop and began searching. His fingers moved mechanically over the keyboard, his mind unable to stop. He searched for anything that might explain the woman, anything that might help him understand what was happening to him. Hours passed, and still, there was nothing. No information. No leads. No explanations. His mind refused to rest. It circled around the same thoughts over and over. Her words. The way she spoke. You'll remember soon enough. But remember what? And why did it feel like she was playing some kind of game with him? Frustrated, Ethan slammed his hand on the desk, the sound reverberating in the empty room. The words she had said echoed in his mind, you'll remember soon enough. He thought he could almost hear her voice in the back of his mind, as if she was closer than before. But it wasn't just her voice. It was something else, a presence, something creeping in at the edges of his thoughts. Suddenly, his phone buzzed on the desk, startling him. He looked down, half expecting to see her name on the screen, but it was an unknown number. He picked it up, hesitated, and then answered. Hello? I told you you'd remember, the voice on the other end whispered, sending a wave of cold through his entire body. It's time, Ethan. Time to remember who you really are. The line went dead. Ethan's phone call had left him reeling. His heart hammered in his chest as the words echoed in his mind. Time to remember who you really are. Who was he? The question repeated over and over in his mind, like a drumbeat getting louder and louder. He had spent his life building a persona, his job, his relationships, his reputation. But this woman, this stranger who knew him in ways that no one could, had shattered it all in an instant. The world felt different now, distorted. Every corner of his apartment seemed darker, the walls closer. He could almost feel the weight of her gaze pressing against him, even though she wasn't here. The fear that had taken root in his chest felt like it was feeding off his confusion, growing stronger the more he tried to deny it. Ethan needed answers, but the more he searched, the deeper the rabbit hole seemed to go. He pulled out old photographs, sifting through memories he hadn't thought about in years, faces, places, names, but nothing felt right. It was like staring into a reflection that wasn't his own, like the person in the pictures was someone he used to be but no longer recognized. For hours, he pored over anything he could find, old journals, social media accounts, even his own medical records, but each piece of information only led to more questions. There was nothing, no clues, no signs that he had ever known this woman. No evidence that they had met before. He slammed his hands down on the desk in frustration, causing his coffee mug to spill over. The hot liquid splashed across the papers, staining the pages with smudged ink. He cursed under his breath and wiped at the mess, his eyes still darting across the cluttered desk, desperate for something that could explain what was happening to him. Then, a thought struck him. He rushed to his bookshelf, pulling out an old photo album that had been gathering dust in the corner. It was filled with pictures from his childhood, from moments he had almost forgotten. He flipped through the pages quickly, searching for something, anything, familiar. His finger paused on a photo near the back. It was a group picture taken at a family reunion when he was about 10 years old. There, standing next to his mother, was a woman he didn't recognize. She was young, with long dark hair and piercing green eyes. A smile played on her lips, but there was something unsettling about it, something too knowing. Something that didn't belong. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be her? Could this be the woman who had appeared out of nowhere, claiming to know him? The photo seemed to mock him, its sharp edges cutting into his thoughts. He couldn't look away. His mind screamed at him to remember, but it was as though something inside him was blocking the memory, keeping it just out of reach. The woman in the photo was standing so close to his mother, her arm draped casually around her shoulders, as if they had known each other forever. But he had no memory of her. None. The name that should have accompanied her face, nothing. He quickly scanned the back of the photo for any notes, any words that could give him a hint. But there was nothing. No date, no names, just the image itself staring back at him. His hands shook as he turned the page to see the next photo. But the next one wasn't like the others. It was different. It was a photo of a dark alley, the shadows stretching long across the pavement, with only a single figure standing in the middle. A woman. The woman. She stood there, facing the camera, her head slightly tilted as if she was waiting for him. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. How was this possible? How could this photo exist? He had never taken it. He had never been to this alley. This wasn't his memory, but it was his. It felt like it was. Every fiber of his being was certain that the woman in that photo was somehow linked to him. And then, his mind cracked. He felt something shift, like a door being opened deep within him, and the flood of memories came rushing in, overwhelming him all at once. He saw images, flashes of moments he had long buried, moments with her. He saw her in the background of family gatherings, always watching, always waiting, like a shadow that had been lurking in the corners of his life. He had known her, but he had buried her from his mind. Why had he buried her? The images continued to spiral, faster now, as if he couldn't escape them. But then, something clicked. Ethan collapsed back into his chair, gasping for air. His body trembled with the intensity of what he had just experienced. Those memories, those fragments, were his. But they weren't just his, they were the fragments of someone else's life, someone else's soul that had been implanted into his mind. He had been living a lie. His life had been shaped by the woman. She wasn't a stranger. She was someone he had been, someone he was supposed to be. The memories he had forgotten weren't his, they were hers. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. He wasn't just being watched. He was being manipulated. His entire existence had been altered, twisted by the woman who had been lurking at the edges of his memories, a part of his past he could never remember until now. The woman was no longer just a part of his past, she was now a part of his present. And she wasn't done with him. Not by a long shot. The fear surged again, stronger than ever. His body felt like it was being crushed by the weight of the revelation, like his mind was too small to contain it. But through the panic, one thing was clear, the woman wasn't a stranger. She had been inside his life all along, manipulating the course of his memories. He needed to find her. He had to understand what she wanted, why she had done this to him. But how? How could he track down someone who had been hiding in plain sight, who knew everything about him and yet had never revealed herself? Ethan grabbed his jacket, determination flooding his veins. He had to find her, confront her, demand the truth. No more running. No more hiding. As he stepped out of his apartment and into the night, the city seemed to hum with a new intensity. The streets were empty, too quiet. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the world was holding its breath. He walked with purpose, each step taking him closer to the unknown, to the woman who had changed everything. He knew he was getting closer, but there was a nagging feeling in his chest, a growing sense of dread that he couldn't shake. The woman knew him, knew everything about him. And soon Ethan would know her. But would the truth be enough to save him? Ethan stopped at the entrance of an alley, the very one he had seen in the photograph. The air was thick, oppressive, the shadows seeming to stretch and swallow everything around him. And then, in the distance, he saw her, standing at the end of the alley, watching him. The woman. Her eyes were hidden once again by the same sunglasses, but Ethan knew it was her. He could feel her presence, like a force that was both terrifying and familiar. The fear that had taken root in his chest flared up again, but this time there was no turning back. He walked toward her, his footsteps echoing in the silence. When he reached her, she didn't speak. She didn't need to. She reached up and slowly removed her sunglasses, revealing eyes that were familiar, too familiar. And in that moment, Ethan understood. She wasn't just a part of his past. She was a part of his soul, a dark shadow that had been haunting him from the beginning. "You've remembered," she whispered, her voice like a cold wind. Ethan didn't say anything. He simply stood there, the weight of the truth pressing down on him, suffocating him. And then, the shadows around them began to move. Ethan stood motionless in front of the woman, the weight of his thoughts pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of the overwhelming truth he had just uncovered. She was not just a figure from his past. She was a part of him. A part he had forgotten, erased, and buried deep within himself. The alley around them seemed to twist and warp, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. The light from the street lamps flickered, casting eerie shapes that danced along the walls. The air felt thick, and the world itself seemed to close in around them, suffocating him. The woman stood still, her eyes locked onto his, unreadable, yet somehow knowing. She smiled, and this time there was no warmth in it, only a chilling, predatory grin. The kind of smile that made your skin crawl, that made you question everything you thought you knew about yourself. "You've remembered," she whispered, her voice soft but carrying an unsettling weight. "You've remembered everything, haven't you, Ethan?" His chest tightened. The truth was there, clawing at the edges of his consciousness. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but his voice caught in his throat. The memories, his life, flashed before him again, fragments that now made sense. It was all starting to come together, like a shattered puzzle, pieces finally clicking into place. He saw his childhood, his family, but it was all wrong. Faces blurred, details changed, as if someone had been altering the picture all along. He saw her in the background of those memories, always watching, always there, shaping his life in ways he hadn't understood. She had been present during the moments he thought were his own, bending the reality around him like a puppeteer controlling its marionette. Ethan's eyes widened, a terrible realization dawning on him. "You did this to me," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper, trembling with the weight of the truth. "You've been controlling me. You've been in my mind all this time." She stepped closer, the shadows seeming to part as she moved. Her presence filled the space, and with it, the dread that had been growing inside him intensified. The air around him grew colder, as if the very essence of life was being drained away. "Not just controlling," she said, her smile widening. "I've been creating you, Ethan. Your life, your memories, your existence, none of it is real. It's all been shaped by me, by the things you forgot. You were never meant to be this person." Ethan staggered back, his mind spinning as the world around him seemed to bend and warp. He shook his head, disbelieving. This couldn't be true. It couldn't be. It had to be a lie. "I don't understand," he gasped. "Why? Why do this to me?" The woman's smile faded, replaced by something darker, something more insidious. "You're not the first, Ethan. You were just the next in line. The experiment, it's been going on for years." The words hit Ethan like a slap to the face. Experiment? He tried to piece together what she was saying, but the truth was so monstrous, so incomprehensible, that his mind couldn't fully process it. She wasn't just a stranger who had come into his life. She was part of something much bigger, something far more terrifying than he could have imagined. "What experiment?" he demanded, his voice breaking through the horror. "What have you done to me?" The woman stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with a cold, calculating intensity. "The experiment, Ethan, is the manipulation of the mind. The alteration of memories. the creation of new lives. She paused, as if savoring the words, we have been perfecting it for years. You were chosen because of your mind's fragility. You were perfect for it. Your memories were easy to twist, to replace with something else. You were meant to be someone else. A chill ran through him as he realized the truth. His memories, the life he had built, his job, his relationships, even his love for certain places, none of it had been real. It was a facade, a carefully constructed illusion. He had been part of an experiment to shape, control, and manipulate the human mind. He had been a lab rat, living in a cage of his own making, and the woman before him was the one pulling the strings all along. I'm not real, Ethan muttered, the words escaping his lips before he could stop them. His world was crumbling around him. None of it is real. Her smile returned, this time with a sickening sweetness. No, Ethan. You are real. You were always real. But the life you've been living? That was never yours. Ethan's mind reeled, the sheer scale of what she was saying threatening to break him. He had no anchor, no point of reference. He didn't know who he was anymore. You want to remember, don't you? The woman asked, her voice soft, almost coaxing. You want to remember what's real. What's yours? He shook his head violently, as though trying to shake off the flood of memories that were rushing back, reshaping his very identity. No, he spat. I don't want to remember. I don't want any of this. I don't want you in my head anymore. Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time, there was a hint of something darker in them, something feral. She was no longer just the woman who had manipulated his life. She was the embodiment of everything he feared, everything he had tried to bury. You have no choice, she said, her voice hard, unyielding. You've always been a part of this. You've always been my creation, Ethan. And now, you're mine again. In a moment of sheer panic, Ethan lunged toward her, but as his hands reached out, the world around him blurred. The alley, the buildings, the entire city seemed to distort, as if reality itself was shifting beneath his feet. The fear, that cold, suffocating fear, gripped him once more, and he could feel himself slipping away. Stop, he screamed. Please. But the woman just watched, her smile widening until it seemed to stretch impossibly wide. You never knew who you were, she said, her voice becoming a distant whisper as his vision darkened. But now, you'll never forget. And then, the world went black. When Ethan woke, it was as if nothing had changed. The same room, the same bed, the same city outside his window. But he knew better. The truth was buried deep inside him now, etched into his soul like a brand. He was different. The woman was gone, but her presence lingered in the air, thick and oppressive. He could still feel her watching him, waiting for him to understand. To remember. His phone buzzed beside him, the screen flashing with a message. His hands trembled as he reached for it, but when he opened the message, it was simply a reminder, time to remember, Ethan. The message was from an unknown number. The same number he had seen before. And in that moment, as the weight of his situation bore down on him, he knew that his nightmare was just beginning. There was no escaping it. There was no way to undo what had been done. The life he had known was gone, replaced with a twisted truth. And the woman, the stranger who knew him, was the key to everything. He wasn't just a victim. He was part of something far bigger than he could have imagined. And no matter how far he ran, no matter how hard he tried to escape, he would always be hers. Underscore 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 underscore.
Story 6. Samantha had always been a light sleeper. It wasn't uncommon for her to wake up several times during the night, her mind restless with the anxieties of the day. But this was different. These were not the typical sleepless nights she had grown accustomed to. No, these dreams had started with a peculiar intensity, an unsettling sense of familiarity that haunted her long after she woke up. It started a week ago. At first, it seemed harmless enough. She dreamt of a room, dimly lit, with peeling wallpaper and an air of abandonment. It felt like an old attic, a space long forgotten by the world. The room was empty except for one thing, a large, rectangular window on the far wall. It was the only source of light, and through it, Samantha could see nothing but thick darkness, swirling like fog. She would stand in front of the window, her hand on the cold glass, and stare out into the nothingness beyond. But the strange part, the part that lingered in her mind, was the sensation that something was waiting on the other side. Something that was watching her, waiting for her to open the window. And every time she had the dream, she would hesitate, torn between the desire to open it and the deep, primal fear that came with it. The first few times, she woke up before she could make a choice. But then, last night, she had done it. She had opened the window. When Samantha awoke, the memory of the dream was still vivid, as if the air around her was still thick with the tension of that moment. Her heart raced, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts as she tried to shake the feeling of dread that clung to her. It had felt so real, so undeniable. When she opened the window, she expected the darkness to swallow her whole. But instead, a cold wind had rushed in, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of something rotten, something decayed. She remembered the feeling of her hair lifting, as if the air itself had become alive. And then, just before she woke, she saw it, the faint outline of a figure, barely visible in the distance, standing just beyond the window, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Samantha jolted upright in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced around her room, the familiar surroundings offering little comfort. The dark corners seemed deeper now, as though the shadows themselves were closing in. She could hear the sound of her own breathing, loud in the stillness of the night, as she tried to calm herself. It was just a dream, she told herself, but something deep inside her told her it wasn't. She needed to forget it. But as the days passed, the dream continued to haunt her. Each night, she would return to that same room, the window, the darkness. Each time, she would open it, feeling the coldness seep into her bones, but the figure, just beyond her reach, never came closer. Not yet. Samantha shook the sleep from her head and tried to focus on the mundane. It was a Wednesday morning, and she had a full day ahead of her. She forced herself to go through the motions, coffee, breakfast, work, but the sense of dread was never far behind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the dream wasn't just a figment of her imagination. She spent her day distracted, unable to focus, as if a thin thread of fear had attached itself to her thoughts. She couldn't even concentrate on the phone calls she was making for work, her mind always drifting back to that window, that shadow. When she closed her eyes, even for a moment, the image would rush back to her. She hadn't mentioned the dreams to anyone. Who could she talk to? What would she say? I've been dreaming of a window that leads to nowhere, and there's something waiting on the other side. She knew how insane that would sound. But the truth was, the more she thought about it, the more certain she was that it wasn't just a dream. It was a warning. A premonition. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Samantha had already changed her routine. She locked all the windows in her apartment, even though there was no real reason to be afraid. She made sure the curtains were drawn tightly, the world outside obscured by heavy fabric. It didn't stop the creeping unease that had settled into her chest, but at least she didn't have to look out into the night. But as the evening wore on, she couldn't help but feel as if she were being watched. And then, just as she was about to turn off the light and crawl into bed, she saw it. Her bedroom window. It was open. The curtains were parted slightly, a faint breeze causing them to flutter ever so gently. Her stomach dropped. Samantha rushed toward the window, her heart pounding in her chest. How had it opened? She distinctly remembered closing it before she left that morning. She grabbed the edge of the window and pulled it shut with a force that startled her. It clicked into place with a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. The room was suddenly too quiet. The sounds of the city outside seemed muffled, distant, as if the world had stopped turning, and the only thing that remained was her own unease. Her hand hovered over the curtains, and for a moment she was tempted to pull them back, to look outside, to see if something was there. But she stopped herself. The last time she had opened the window, she had felt it, the presence, the pull of something lurking just beyond her sight. She didn't want to go near it again. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that the window wasn't just a window. It wasn't just a passage between her world and the outside world. It was something else, something more sinister, something that wanted to come inside. The dream, the shadow, the cold breeze, it was all connected. The window was not just a symbol. It was a gateway. And as much as she wanted to believe it was all in her head, deep down, Samantha knew the truth. She had opened it once, and something had slipped through. The following night, Samantha lay awake in bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as the shadows in her room danced with the flickering light of her bedside lamp. The feeling of unease had only grown since the window had opened by itself, the sense of something creeping closer pressing on her chest. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the leaves outside, felt like an intrusion, like something was trying to enter her world from the other side. Her mind was foggy with exhaustion, but the dream from the night before was still fresh in her thoughts. The window, always the same window, standing open in the dream, inviting her to cross the threshold into something she couldn't comprehend. The darkness on the other side of the glass was never empty. It was always full of eyes, of shapes that moved just out of her vision. She turned on her side, pulling the covers up to her chin, as if trying to shield herself from something unseen. The world outside her apartment felt distant now, like a place she no longer belonged. In the quiet of the night, she felt a terrible loneliness that seemed to seep from the walls, an oppressive weight that threatened to suffocate her. Samantha reached out and grabbed her phone from the nightstand. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked it, her eyes scanning the screen. She wanted to find something, anything, to distract herself. A friend to talk to, a piece of news to ground her, but all she saw were messages from work, reminders of obligations she didn't feel up to facing. The clock on the wall ticked slowly. It was well past midnight, but sleep still eluded her. She stood up abruptly, the weight of the silence in the room suffocating her. She needed to check the window again to make sure it was locked. She needed to make sure it wouldn't open again while she slept. With a deep, shaky breath, she crossed the room, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. The curtains were drawn tightly, just as they had been earlier. Samantha's hand lingered on the edge of the window frame, her fingers cold against the glass. She hesitated for a moment, glancing over her shoulder at the stillness of the room. There was no sound, no movement, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she reached out and pulled the curtains aside, her heart hammering in her chest. The window was shut tight. No breeze stirred the air, no movement outside disturbed the quiet. Everything seemed normal, but it wasn't. It couldn't be. She had seen it, felt it, the night before. That presence, waiting just beyond the glass, its shape barely visible in the dark. She knew it was still there, lurking, waiting for her to make a mistake. Waiting for her to open the window again. The fear wrapped around her, gnawing in her stomach as she stared at the glass. Something was out there. She had felt it. The sensation of being watched, of being drawn into something she couldn't escape. Her eyes darted to the corner of the room where shadows pooled, dark and thick, as if they had weight. Her breath quickened as the silence stretched on. She was about to step back when she felt it. The slightest shift in the air. A change. A pressure building behind her, as if the room itself were closing in. And then, the window moved. The sound of the glass creaking echoed through the room, sharp and unnatural. Her eyes widened as she spun around, the curtain now swaying gently, the window slowly opening on its own, just as it had the night before. A cold gust of wind swept into the room, sending a shiver down her spine. She stood frozen, her body trembling, unable to move. The darkness beyond the window seemed to pulse, as though it were alive, waiting for her to make the next move. Then it happened. The shadow. The first time, it was just a flicker at the edge of her vision. But now, standing in the opening of the window, a shape began to emerge from the darkness. Slowly, like a figure stepping out of fog, it began to take form. Tall, thin, almost impossibly so, with limbs that seemed too long, stretching out of the shadows. Its features were hidden, but the feeling of rawness radiated from it. The figure's eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, stared directly at her. Samantha felt a jolt of pure terror course through her veins. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure didn't move, it didn't need to. It was there. It had crossed over from the darkness beyond the window and was standing in her room, unseen but present. Watching. A low, almost imperceptible hum filled the room, the sound vibrating through her chest. She could feel it in her bones, a deep resonance that shook her to her core. The longer she stared at the figure, the more she felt herself drawn toward it, as if some unseen force was pulling her in. Her heart raced. She couldn't breathe. The air felt thick and suffocating, like it was closing in on her from all sides. And then, in a sudden rush, the presence was gone. The room was still, silent, empty. Samantha stumbled back, her mind reeling from the experience. She slammed the window shut, her hand shaking as she pulled the curtains tightly closed. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and she backed away from the window, her legs giving way beneath her. It was too much. She couldn't do this. She couldn't live with this constant fear gnawing at her, pulling at her sanity. The window, the creature, it was all too much. But the question remained, why? Why had it come? Why now? And more importantly, what had she opened? Samantha didn't sleep that night. The encounter, the figure, had rattled her more deeply than she cared to admit. She tried to convince herself it was all just a dream, a product of her mind playing tricks on her in the dead of night. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that was slipping through the cracks between the world she knew and the dark, distorted one beyond. The next day, she told herself she would be fine. She would go about her routine, ignore the incident, and push it to the back of her mind. But the truth was, it had already burrowed its way into her thoughts. Every shadow seemed to pulse with unseen life, every corner seemed darker. She felt the cold air around her, felt it creeping into her very skin. And then, as she walked into the grocery store that afternoon, she saw it again, the woman who had been following her in the dreams. She was standing by the checkout, her back to Samantha, but there was no mistaking the dark sunglasses, the long, dark hair, the faintly knowing smile. The woman turned her head slowly, and for a brief moment, their eyes met across the crowded store. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. The woman gave a small nod, acknowledging her without a word. But it was enough. She knew. And in that instant, Samantha realized the truth, the window, the dreams, the shadow. It wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was real. And now, it was coming for her. Samantha couldn't remember the last time she felt truly safe. The days had blurred together, each one sinking into the next like an endless loop. The dreams, the window, the shadow. Each night, they grew stronger, more insistent. And now, in the waking world, they were creeping into every moment, turning her reality into something unrecognizable. The woman in the grocery store was just the beginning. Samantha tried to convince herself that it was a coincidence, but she couldn't shake the eerie certainty that it wasn't. The woman had known her. And when their eyes met, something passed between them, an unspoken understanding that sent a jolt of fear through her chest. It was like the woman had been waiting for something, waiting for Samantha to realize what was happening, to finally accept that the nightmare she was living in wasn't just a dream. The feeling of being watched intensified. It was as though something was following her, shadowing her every step, even in the bright daylight. She couldn't go anywhere without feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon her, as if the boundaries between her world and the world beyond the window were starting to erode. She didn't sleep that night. Her thoughts were a tangled mess of fragments, snatches of memories she didn't understand, glimpses of that dark figure waiting just beyond the glass. The air in her apartment felt thick, oppressive, like it was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the wrong move. The window. The one in her dreams. It was always there, always open, always waiting for her to cross the threshold. But what would happen if she did? What would come through if she opened it again? The following afternoon, as Samantha walked home from work, she noticed her phone vibrating in her pocket. She pulled it out, half expecting it to be a call from her mother or a friend checking in. But it wasn't. It was a message from an unknown number. "You know it's time, don't you? Come find me." Samantha froze in her tracks. Her fingers shook as she stared at the message. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her stomach churn. She didn't need to ask who it was. She knew. The woman. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. This wasn't a coincidence. This was something far more deliberate. And Samantha knew she couldn't run from it any longer. She had tried to deny the truth, tried to push it away, but the dream, the shadow, the woman, they were all connected. And now, it was clear, whatever this was, it wasn't just happening in her sleep. It was happening in the real world, too. Samantha typed a quick response, her fingers trembling on the screen. "Where are you?" Almost instantly, the reply came, "I'm where you left me. Come find me. It's time for you to open the door." Samantha's mind reeled. She had been warned about this. The opening. The window. She had felt it, that sense of inevitability. But what door was she talking about? The door to the room in her dreams? The one that seemed locked until now? And then, the final message came through, and this one sent a shiver down her spine. The window is always open. You just need to step through. Her breath hitched. The shadow had been waiting for her. The window wasn't just an object in her dream. It was a door to something else. Something that had been waiting for her to open it, and now she had no choice. She had to confront whatever it was that had crossed over from the other side. Without thinking, she grabbed her jacket and left her apartment. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to follow the trail. It wasn't just curiosity driving her now, it was desperation. She needed to understand what had happened to her, what this was. And she needed to stop it before it consumed her completely. The streets were eerily quiet as Samantha walked, the city around her seeming almost abandoned, as though everyone else had already fled. It was almost as if she were the only person left in the world, walking toward an unseen fate. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, the only sound accompanying her as she moved. The message had said, "I'm where you left me." Samantha's mind raced as she tried to think of what that could mean. But as she turned the corner onto a street she didn't recognize, something stopped her cold. The building in front of her was old, weathered, like something out of a forgotten dream. It had the same peeling wallpaper, the same dimly lit hallway, the same thick, suffocating air she had felt in her dreams. It was the place she had seen before, in those flashes of memory she could never quite place. It was the room she had visited over and over in her sleep, the place where the window had opened, where the shadow had emerged. The woman's words echoed in her mind, "Come find me." Samantha felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as she approached the door. She didn't want to open it. She didn't want to step into the nightmare that had haunted her for so long. But she couldn't stop herself. She had to know. She had to face whatever was waiting on the other side. With trembling hands, she pushed open the door. The room inside was exactly as she remembered it, the same peeling wallpaper, the same dusty floorboards, and in the center of the far wall, the same window. This time, however, it was open. Not ajar, not halfway open, but wide open, as if inviting her to step through. The darkness beyond it seemed to swallow the room, the edges of the window glowing faintly as if something were pushing against the glass, waiting to be let in. The figure. She could feel it again, just beyond the window, pressing against the barrier. It wasn't fully here yet, but it would be soon. She could feel the pressure building, as if the very fabric of the room was about to snap, as if the space between the world she knew and the one beyond was about to collapse. Samantha stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. The room seemed to warp around her, the walls pulling inward as if they were alive, as if the house itself were breathing. She couldn't stop herself now. She was too close. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the window's cold frame, and she felt it, the presence, pulling at her, urging her to open the window wider. And then, just as she touched the glass, the figure moved. A cold wind rushed through the room, slamming the window wide open. The darkness beyond it poured into the room, filling every inch with its oppressive weight. The shadow had crossed over. Samantha felt a chill run down her spine as the figure stepped through the window, its form growing larger, more defined. Its eyes locked onto hers, glowing faintly in the dark, and she knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was too late to turn back. The creature, the shadow, whatever it was here. And there was no escape. Samantha could feel the weight of the darkness pressing against her chest as the shadow stepped fully into the room. The cold air that poured in from the open window filled the space with a damp, suffocating chill. Her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as she tried to steady herself, but every inch of her body was screaming to run. But her legs wouldn't move. She couldn't move. The shadow loomed in front of her, its form shifting and warping like smoke. It was tall, impossibly so, its limbs stretched too far, too long. The edges of its figure blurred, flickering in and out of existence like a broken film reel. But the eyes were what held her there. They glowed faintly in the dark, not a harsh light, but a soft, almost seductive glow that seemed to pull at her very soul. "You opened the window," the shadow whispered, its voice low and gravelly, like the sound of leaves rustling on a forgotten grave. "Now I'm here. And you'll never be the same." Samantha's heart pounded in her chest, the words reverberating in her mind like a warning bell. This wasn't just some nightmare anymore. This was real. The thing she had felt in her dreams was standing in front of her, in the real world, waiting for her to understand. But she didn't want to understand. She wanted to run. She wanted to wake up from this nightmare. Please, she thought desperately. This isn't real. This can't be real. The shadow's form flickered again, and for a brief moment it almost seemed to smile. Samantha could feel its cold breath on her face as it drew closer, its presence enveloping her, suffocating her with an ancient, malevolent energy. And then it spoke again. "You've been here before, Samantha." Its voice was like ice in her veins. "You've been here countless times before. This is your fate. You've always known it, even if you couldn't remember." Samantha's mind reeled, the words crashing into her like a flood, pulling her under. The feeling of déjà vu, the sense that this moment had happened before, that she had been standing in this room with the shadow, was overwhelming. She tried to resist, to block it out, but the memories flooded her mind, unbidden and relentless. She saw herself as a child, her small fingers pressed against the same window, staring out into the same darkness. She saw herself in the same room, a younger version of herself, more innocent, more unaware. And there, in the shadows, the figure had been waiting, just as it had been waiting for her now. No, Samantha thought. No, this isn't possible. This isn't my memory. But it was. The pieces fell into place with terrifying clarity. She had known the shadow all along. It had always been there, lurking at the edge of her reality, quietly pulling the strings, shaping her life, guiding her to this moment. It wasn't just a dream. It wasn't just a manifestation of her fear. It was something more. It had always been more. And now, it was time for her to pay the price for what she had opened. The shadow moved closer, its form shifting in the darkness. You spent your life running from it, it murmured, its voice echoing in her mind. But you can't run anymore, Samantha. You've opened the window, and now it's time for you to face the consequences. The air grew heavier, pressing down on her chest, as if the weight of the world was collapsing in on itself. Samantha's vision blurred as the darkness closed in, her mind spiraling into panic. Her pulse raced, and her thoughts turned to nothing but fear. The creature's glowing eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, everything went silent. It was as if the world had stopped turning, as if there was no sound, no motion, no life. And then, in a flash of understanding, Samantha realized something. The shadow was not just a manifestation of her fear. It was the embodiment of everything she had denied, everything she had suppressed. The things she had never wanted to face, the truths she had buried deep within herself. It was not just the thing that had crossed over from the window, it was the thing she had always kept locked inside, the thing she had never allowed herself to confront. This was her. This was her own darkness. The shadow reached out, its cold, intangible fingers brushing against Samantha's arm. She flinched, but it was too late. The moment its touch made contact, something inside her shifted. The room grew colder, the shadows around her deepening, pulling her into the abyss. And then, she heard the voice again. It's time, Samantha. She could feel the weight of her own past, her own choices, pressing down on her. Every regret, every fear, every hidden truth was now laid bare before her. She had been running from herself, from the things she had buried so deep inside. And now, those things had come to claim her. But there was a choice. She realized that now, in the deepest part of herself, she could let the shadow take her, consume her, as it had been waiting to do for so long. She could surrender to the darkness that had always been a part of her. Or she could fight. With every ounce of strength she had left, Samantha pushed the shadow's hand away, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she fought to reclaim control. Her body trembled with the effort, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. If she did, it would be over. And then, just as quickly as the shadow had appeared, it receded. The pressure lifted. The darkness that had threatened to consume her dissipated, leaving behind only the cold, empty room. Samantha collapsed to her knees, her heart still racing, her mind reeling from the intensity of what had just transpired. The figure was gone, but its presence lingered in the room like a heavy fog that wouldn't lift. The window, too, was still open, wide open, as if daring her to return. But she couldn't go back. Not now. The room was silent once more. The shadows had receded, but the air still felt thick, like it was waiting for something. Samantha stood slowly, her legs weak, her hands shaking as she pulled the curtain shut once more. She couldn't risk it. She couldn't let the window open again. For the first time in weeks, she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. The fear had not entirely dissipated, but it had lost its grip on her. She had faced the shadow, the darkness within herself, and had emerged stronger. But the dream, the window, it would always be with her. She knew that now. The window wasn't just a passage to something else. It was a part of her. A part of the world she couldn't escape. The shadow might have receded, but it was always waiting, just beyond the glass, just beyond the veil. And she knew, deep down, that someday it would return.